Here we go. And we're live.
Okay.
Hey.
Live once again. Nice to be back. Looking forward to some of these conversations.
Someone's gonna mute there.
Yes. Somebody's also watching the stream.
Yeah, I opened the stream up.
So yeah, good to be back for the second live stream. Thanks to everyone who has jumped in to join us. It's great to have you all here.
Yeah, I don't have a champagne bottle this time.
I've got some.
I won't be popping any corks.
Well, I suppose we'll have to make it through without the alcohol this time. Hopefully that wasn't the source of the magic.
I've still got some.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to be drinking through this whole live stream. Yeah, no, it's really great to have these casual chances to engage with people who are reading Psymposia and listening to the podcast. It's really important to us as an organization that it's trying to tell complicated stories, provide receipts, shine a light on a lot of things that are happening simultaneously, to be aware of what people are thinking out there as we do so.
Yeah, and on that note, please feel free to chime in the chat with any comments, questions, topics you'd like us to discuss, things you want to engage with. We're trying to have this be as interactive as possible. And I thought last time we had some really good back and forth with the folks who had popped in. So
definitely,
please don't hold back.
So on the stream, who do we have here? We've got Nishay Deveneaux, Dr. Nishay Deveneaux.
Yeah. Have you heard that whole hubbub about Jill Biden?
Yeah. That's capital Dr. Nishay Deveneaux.
I will take my 6 years of intense work and have nothing but that to show for it now. So I'm happy being called doctor.
We've got David Nichols on the live stream. And Brian Normans.
Oh, hello.
As well as Russell Hausfeld.
Hey.
Who are you?
And Dr. Brian Pace, by the way.
So yeah, I guess just as a quick update, I mean, we wanted to go over, we recently did a rundown of, well, I guess just before we hopped on, we did a little rundown of MindMed comparing themselves to Tesla, which actually we realized as we were doing it tied in a little bit to the Thought Leader podcast that we recorded a week or so
no one's
ago.
Heard any of this.
Right. It hasn't been released yet. No, and this is not, I wasn't saying that with the hope that people would hear, but more
as
to
you
promote,
all know.
to promote the fact that there's a few episodes in the pipeline that are coming out dealing with sort of these individualized solutions for systemic problems. The folks who are trying to get paid off of promoting them. The silly sort of thought leadery spiels coming from, I don't know, everyone from microdosing coach Paul Austin to a variety of other folks in psychedelia, and sort of the explosion in hot takes from from folks who are looking to kind of corner the market as talking heads in a hot new industry. So
is it worth saying, just in case, because just we don't know who's on, just that we look at the intersection of capitalism and psychedelics, just as some context. I feel like that, just in case there's someone who just happened to pop in.
For sure. And I mean, right now that is an area that we and others anticipated it being an issue. I would say we would call it a problem. Others call it an opportunity, which reminds me of something I read a little while ago. And it was that MBAs and Marxists know the same things. It's just that, leftos think it's not such a great thing, and MBAs are really excited about cashing in on these facts. So yeah, I mean, there's a huge It's night and day as what the psychedelic space was 5 years ago. Now we're probably, are we approaching actually like 100 actual companies, or are we still in the low 50s here that are?
No, we're well over 100.
That's kind of what I thought.
They put out like a big list, and it was,
yeah,
I feel like near 100.
That was my sense as well. So I mean, that's major. Psychedelic science. There was Compass Pathways and a few sort of people wandering around, playing cards close to their chest.
I even saw, because who is it that has Psychedelic Jobs has like a list of hirings like in the field, and they were even, I was thinking this would be perfect for us. They were looking for someone to, I forget who it was, but someone was hiring like an analyst like of the field, like the companies and the lay of the land, and it was like part-time, could be full-time, but so it's like not only are there the companies, but there's the companies about the companies that are kind of sprawling out
the industry.
Well, if anyone wants to work for Delic, I don't know if they're still looking for it, but there was a point at which they were trying to hire someone to go undercover, including into nonprofits, to find out how many of them were living up to their values or something like that.
And I don't know if you've heard, but they just hit their highest page views ever. They put out a whole press release about it.
I did hear. Yeah, so congratulations.
I want to give a shout out to Jim in chat. Jim was super helpful for us when we decided that we were gonna.
Oh, hey Jim,
go nonprofit. So I wanted to say hello to Jim and thank you for all that work. Jim has been wonderful.
Looking in the chat too, there's a question from Stephen Bright about the Conscious Fund. As their website doesn't give much away other than affiliations, one of their project called The Hive is recruiting for a CCO on LinkedIn. So I don't have a ton of info on the Consciousness Fund. They used to be the Cannabis Fund. They're located, if memory serves, in Malta. And so Malta is another one of those sort of havens for companies that may not be entirely on the up and up, or and I can't say for sure.
Did you say haven?
I did say haven. No comment on haven either. But no, for the Consciousness Fund, I know at one point
Conscious Fund,
sorry, one of the folks affiliated with them was asked why they were located in Malta, and did sort of what Pace was just talking about how like, lefties and MBAs having the same analysis. And he was like, well, it's a really cozy regulatory environment. So why wouldn't they want to be here? I mean, it gives them all the leeway to do all the things that they might want to do. The problem is sort of similarly with Compass Pathways narratives about why they were in the Isle of Man early on. You can't, let's say you get approval somewhere like Malta or Isle of Man to do whatever sort of psychedelic research or what have you. It doesn't generalize. Like the reason that people look to do studies in the US or the UK is because the regulatory requirements are so stringent. It's generally assumed that if you get approval here, you will be able to get approval in other countries. To me, from the outside, when you see these companies operating out of Malta, Isle of Man, other sort of lax regulatory environments, it's an opportunity to play the pump and dump game. Whether or not they're actually doing that, I don't know. But it lets you say, oh, we've gotten these licenses, we're making these moves. Russ actually found a really good or had shared a really great article on some of the companies in cannabis that were engaging in all sorts of handshake deals and kind of smoke and mirror games to pump up their stock. And looking at, so if memory serves as well, the Conscious Fund is also affiliated with the Psychedelic Medicine Association, which I found kind of sketchy, because the notion that you have these folks who don't particularly know much about psychedelics, but are coming at this from a financially incentivized position, looking to make a whole bunch of money on a field that focuses on incredibly vulnerable people. If we consider psychedelic medicine, the notion that you have an investor-backed agency or association, sorry, for practitioners, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I worry about the kind of incentives and the narratives, sorry, that they're incentivized to push as a result of those associations.
Yeah, during also with Malta during the last crypto boom, as the regulatory schemes were getting up and running in various countries, a lot of those companies moved over to Malta.
And crypto didn't have any problems, right? Everything there was great.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also questions, I think, too, when we look at companies that are pivoting straight from cannabis to psychedelics, or from mining to psychedelics, or what have you. As Russ discovered, some of them are real happy to just tell you that it's all about the money. Like they don't. Again, they see no reason
Which
to hide
I find refreshing, to be honest, because I've been thinking, we've talked a lot about this, but it really is a logical contradiction for these people to be pursuing aggressive IP strategy while utilizing the rhetoric of like helping people and solving the mental health crisis, as Christian Angermeyer of Atai has done. If anything, it highlights that the purpose of advertising, which is to, emotionally manipulate people into making, decisions that aren't in their self-interest, to not making rational decisions. Which is one of those things that the market relies on, is individual self-interested people making rational decisions with perfect information, right? So basically, if you're a company out there who has an exclusivity strategy, whether it's regulatory capture or some novel molecule with one bromine to the left, you don't get to honestly say that you are centering patient care and accessibility and all this other stuff that is sort of hinted at in glossy brochures.
Yeah, and I mean, similarly, you can't have those narratives when you're also making disparaging comments about decrim and efforts that would make these compounds accessible outside of your, let's say, $15,000 proprietary treatment plus luxury compound, what have you.
But that's the thing, the backtracking that we saw in that case with J.R. Ron saying, oh, well, I need more education. After there was an outcry, people said, what do you mean you don't want to deal with these decrim people? There's people who've gone to jail for you're standing on the shoulders of these people. It just doesn't play well. But I do find it refreshing when somebody says I'm about the money.
Well, I agree, because then at least you can have the conversation, or put everybody's kind of got their own like sides or whatever in the conversation. Otherwise, it just like halts the conversation in its tracks when they're trying to like be euphemistic about things. Leaves me stomping around my room.
It's also a good indication that you're having a conversation in good faith. If somebody's not able to honestly own their position in the the discourse or the marketplace or whatever you want to call it, how can we come to an understanding?
Well, and the other thing to point out there too is there was an outcry, or there was pushback, but if you look at where that pushback came from, it came from folks who'd been around for a while. And one of the things we've discussed a little bit, not a whole lot, is the changing signal to noise ratio, right? As we have new companies coming in, as we have companies doing reverse takeovers, as we have people flocking to the industry because this is where the money's at, suddenly you find that like the heads and the people who feel invested in these substances, subcultures, communities, what have you, suddenly, let's say Goop's relative position and Gwyneth Paltrow's ability to spin a narrative that holds sway suddenly becomes that much more weighty. Whereas if we compare it with, say, a decade or two ago, Arrowwood's position relative to Goop would have been much higher. And looking at the quality of information, we see like a loss of signal. We see a loss of valuable insight and understanding And for whatever it's worth, there was a recent Vice article that was talking about some of the narratives being pushed by Goop and how bullshit they were. And I thought that the title versus some of what was discussed in there was a little overbroad. The title was something about how, certain cultures haven't used psychedelics as long as people say they have. But I think if you actually drill down into it, it's less about that as a generalized statement and more that this narrative of, let's say, industrial psychedelic use for mental health treatments, that the societies that were using psychedelics frequently weren't using them in a, quote, therapeutic context.
Right.
And packing that apart, because that's the whole basis for, say, Goop's marketing claim. And not to harp on Goop, but I think it's worth noting.
I mean, we can harp on Goop. Like, why not?
Well, I just wanted to point out that in addition to the Maps Canada features on Goop, way back on Netflix, whatever, earlier this year, that recently both, Maps and Chacruna were just hyping Goop again with a question of like, oh, we're really good at capitalism, but how good are we at therapy or something like that? And I was just so confused by the framing of the question. Like, who is this we that's good at capitalism? And what does this mean? And why are we looking to Goop for info on psychedelics?
What was that, Russ?
I was just saying Goop is good at capitalism.
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry for the
yeah.
rant.
Jim's asking how can we get the conversation out of the bubble, though? And saying that similar problems face the marijuana decrim fights for a long time, and it's still ongoing.
I would say, and that's a good question, Jim. Thanks for that. Like, despite what it may look like, listening to some of these conversations, like a good friend of mine listened to some of our podcasts. I guess he's still listening to them. And he said, yeah, +3, you guys are like inside baseball for psychedelics. And I mean, that's fair. Okay. Like we cover things pretty closely. And if you like baseball, there's a lot of commentary on what goes on. We happen to believe that what's happening in psychedelics and mental health and capitalism is a little bit more important than baseball, but hey, we all have our opinions. That said, like, one of the reasons we're on YouTube right now is that's where the online left is. And we've spent a lot of time, talking to the folks that live inside the bubble, the people on the conference circuit at psychedelics, the researchers. I wouldn't want to put a number on it, but the accumulated experience in years on this call right now is in the double digits in the psychedelic space. But something really instructive is going on right now with a bunch of venture capitalists moving into a previously criminalized space and attempting to enclose big chunks of it, privatize it, and running roughshod over social movements that are serious and sincere. And so we see our natural allies actually in the broader left movement of, pursuing human freedom, things like the climate movement, criminal justice reform, prison abolition, that kind of thing. So that's how we get it out of the bubble.
Yeah, and for whatever it's worth, it's something that I know I've been engaged in or trying to work towards pretty much in my entire, time in any sort of public psychedelic sphere. We're going back to, say, 2014 and speaking at the Boom Festival at the end of or one component of a talk called Turn On, Tune In, Rise Up, was precisely how to plug these things into broader culture and questions of, okay, so at the time I was active in a prison books project. I'd been quite active in Occupy and a bunch of other anarchist and radical projects. And I was seeing a lot of burnout among friends. And one of the questions was, well, gee, like I also know friends who have homesteads, including people who were sort of the trippy hippie variety, but also had quite a bit of affinity for people who were on the front lines and getting pepper sprayed and beaten by cops. And so proposing let's say that there is a clear affinity between the people who are running these farms and the people who are getting beat. The fact that, like, you know, the notion of having spaces where people could unplug from that frontline work or from eco defense projects to come in, spend time with other people. Obviously, I would contend that within a decrim environment, it's a hell of a lot easier because, one, you have paranoid activists who could potentially be less paranoid when they didn't have to worry about like meeting new people and using drugs. But two, like creating spaces where you could engage in discourse around different tactics and strategies, right? That it's not just that there needs to be opposition to policing, but also that when we have questions about climate change, the various crises we're facing, and industrial civilization more broadly, how are we going to secure food? What sort of communities do we want to live in? What kind of social relations would we actually need if we wanted to engage in meaningful degrowth, and the kind of steps needed to combat carbonization and various other contributors to all of the ecological crises we see? Yeah, go ahead, Pace.
Well, so, I mean, I read something just recently. It was an opinion piece in the New York Times. I'll throw it in the chat in a minute. But I mean, just sort of going back to that question, how do we get things out of the bubble? To me, it's about making connections. And one of the things that we have been able to do at Psymposia is predict certain happenings, certain trends, because we're aware of broader critiques of capitalism. And, you know, we just sort of do a given this scenario, if then what kind of reasoning. What is that? Is that inductive reasoning? In any case, the COVID situation right now is putting intellectual property under a microscope or on a billboard, because Pfizer, Moderna, they are developing vaccines that are funded almost wholly at taxpayer expense. There are vying contracts where certain countries are buying up the supply, the first offerings of these vaccines. But that's not necessarily like the best strategy for dealing with a pandemic, right? So it goes back to the thing that I was saying earlier. If you're going to center public health, enforcing patents isn't necessarily going to be your first priority. And so this conversation is being had. It's being had at the WTO, and we're definitely seeing the prioritization of intellectual property. So going once more back to the rhetoric that says psychedelics are transformational for addressing the mental health crisis. Well, an intellectual property strategy, a medicalization strategy, given the status of our current medical health system, at least in the U.S., but also elsewhere.
Just a quick, plug. One of our new advisors, Alexander Zajic, he has done a tremendous amount of research, and he's published a bunch of articles on the New Republic. It's an issue he has been following for a long time, on vaccines, IP, big pharma, the history of patenting, how that's been completely fucked over the 20th century. So I would recommend anybody check out his pieces. They're thorough, they're long, they're well researched, and they're really great.
Yeah,
and
we'll be
talking.
Sorry, go.
We're going to be.
I was just going to recommend his little Out of the Ooze booklet too, real quick, while you're plugging.
Hey, if you can find it, throw it in the chat.
Yeah, we'll do.
We're going to be having Alex on the podcast in January, early February, so that'll be out. And this is that issue we're going to be discussing. I mean, the other way to get out of the bubble is just kind of to wait until it pops too, because it's gonna pop.
So there's a concern
that's going to happen eventually, and also I think there was a post the other day, I sent it to Dave a month ago, of Ezra Klein at Vox, who's now moving to New York Times, but he's like getting into it. So like as the thing grows too, it's going to start to other people who weren't, in inside baseball or, in baseball are going to start talking about it too. So it is going to move into those other spheres, and those people are also going to start chiming in on it as well. This is probably the tail end of where we are, I think, and kind of, there's different bubbles here we're talking about. There's the industry bubble, there's the ideological bubble here, but that one's going to start to push into these other areas, I think, too.
Well, and there's, we were just talking about this. So one, in addition to the bubble popping and that being painful both for investors, but also for researchers, right, who are then going to need to make, to my mind, a more compelling case either to future investors or just to the general public as far as their research not being bullshit, even though this industry just had some, massive collapse of funds based on people selling hype and magic. But beyond that, we were just talking on the episode we recorded about if we're talking about psychedelics for mental health, and then if we're viewing psychedelics as sort of one tool in the toolkit, there need to be these broader discussions within psychedelia about psychedelics being precisely one tool, and that if we're talking about people's well-being, we need to be talking about food, clothes, shelter, access to healthcare, all of these material realities. And to my mind, that goes de facto beyond psychedelia. So if you've got people in, and I think this creates a really clear line, let's say, between psychedelic executives who keep coming back to psychedelics as this panacea, as and if not a panacea, as sort of a magic bullet for some of these problems that, 11% of Americans, well, it's 11% of American adults, but, making claims like 11% of Americans are having suicidal thoughts, like serious suicidal ideation. So MindMed is going to save the day by stepping in with psychedelic therapies. What percentage of that 11% is actually going to be able to access those healthcare solutions, even if we imagine that they're as efficacious as possible, right? So the corporate line that they're slinging compared to the material reality doesn't line up. And so to my mind, that should present a bit of a tension point for folks in the community who are legit concerned with psychedelics as mental health treatments, or people who are just more broadly interested in psychedelics and questions of recreational or personal access. To me, that sort of tension point should be one that can be used to highlight both some of the narratives, the bullshit narratives in the space, as well as ways to reach out to whatever, if not the broader left, at least people who care about these issues, sort of regardless of political affinities or stripes.
So one of the things that we've talked a lot about on Psymposia is this idea of narrative. And this is one of Nishay's strong suit, is like the close reading of the subtext, and right now there's like a subtext that's on billboards. There's the sort of common themes that have played out within psychedelia for some time. But Nishay, do you have like a sense of the sort of broader struggle over the story that's happening right now?
Well, there's like a lot of this touches on, I think, the thought leader episode that's going to be coming out shortly that we just recorded. When did we record that? Was that a few days ago?
Like last
week.
Okay, my thoughts of time is a little confused.
But
just that there are, and it also relates to Eric Davis talking on the panel at ICPR with me, that there are these kind of competing ideas, but there's like a differential of power and funding behind those ideas. So it's not like it's an actually democratic conversation. It's not like everyone's coming with like equal PR teams behind that, and like it bites both ways though, because it's like the Delic press release that just came out today. That was, I didn't read the whole thing, but even the headline saying that they have like all these.
Only needed the headline.
That Delic has all of these like views now or whatever, and just I'm sure that there was some kind of PR angling behind that, but like it also kind of, if you're not in that world, looks kind of cringy, so it's like there are even with all the money and the power and everything, like there are drawbacks, like that you end up looking a certain way or having a certain kind of obliviousness to the way that your message reads outside of that closed circle that you're in. So there are like little jujitsu exploitable kind of openings in those power differentials. But I think that challenges the kinds of conversations that are happening when like a whole bunch of like money and prestige is behind one version of the conversation, and then, you know, a bunch of scrappy rebels are trying to hold up the other side of the tent. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
and we've seen
like,
that. Sorry.
Are you saying that money and power and PR, they can buy you page views, but they can't buy you love?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Well, and we've seen those narratives play out sort of over and over again. It's like, it's almost like this cookie cutter format that, you know, whether we're talking about Eleusis claiming that the traditional use of psychedelics was as subperceptible anti-inflammatories, which, you know, to my mind was like a hard cringe for anyone who'd been around the space for a while. And of course, like asking a litany of ethnobotanists and pharmacologists, they were all like, this is nonsense. What are you talking about? You know, or looking at, say the way that Ronan Levy at that ICPR panel straight up said to you, Nishay, and Eric Davis, like, you know, why shouldn't I be able to pay my way in and like, you know, make these comments, like, just because I've bought my way in, like, look, we still want to do things and capitalism can be used for good. But then when you start drilling down into it, there's no real substance there. It's like, yes, you've gotten here because you had the money to get here. But then he kept saying throughout that conversation too, oh my God, I wasn't prepared for such an intellectually rich conversation. And it's like, yeah, you've been at all of these investor focused conferences with people who don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Go figure, you know? And it's kind of sad to see.
It is. I felt that way about the Eleusis press release, is that like, but by making these kind of silly claims or making like claims that are too big for their britches, like it totally took away like what Eleusis is doing is kind of cool. Like the anti-inflammatory stuff is really interesting, and that's kind of promising. But the like taking it out of context and making it this whole thing that it wasn't, like, puts a bad taste in your mouth. Yeah.
Well, and the story behind that is fascinating too. You know, you've got Dave Nichols and Chuck Nichols going back and forth on these cell cultures that, you know, shouldn't have reacted to DOI, but then they did, and none of Chuck's colleagues thought that could be the case.
DOI being a very high affinity to 5-HT2A and a very potent psychedelic that lasts 24 hours or so,
longer.
It's an excellent candidate to end the challenges in mental health then.
Yeah.
I thought that we were talking in Signal earlier today, and that point, what did you say about because you drive around for a living, right? And so you were saying
there's a spot that's in Boston that is, if anyone in Boston, the Mass Ave corner there is like it's filled with people with addiction, homeless people, everything else like that, and it's just so appalling to me going by there every time, because there's billion-dollar hospitals right there with CEOs making tons of money right there, and yeah, basically, like, I'm gonna go up to these people and say, "Oh, look, the recent research shows that the 5-HT2A receptor is gonna, potentially solve the mental health challenges that you have." It's so silly. We were just talking about that on the last podcast. It's so silly, and what people actually need is what Dave points to every day is food, clothes, and shelter, and they don't have that. Actually, they don't have that.
Right.
So the thought of psychedelics is just, it's silly. It's fantasy land.
Was it
Brian,
to think that
I
you can
liked,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, normally I liked what you said in the recording about like, if you think the solution to COVID issues is like a psychedelic treatment that's not going to be approved for like half a
years.
decade, then you're wrong. Like along those lines.
It's silly. It's actually really silly. People are stressed. Work life, perhaps mental health has suffered over the last 4 to 5 decades now because the working class has had absolute wage stagnation while the top percent has ballooned
since the 70s.
Yeah, since the 70s.
Shay, you were going to say something a minute ago. Well,
just that, like, yeah, there's so many more practical ways to really have substantial change and impact on people's mental health, like, you know, making sure that they have food and shelter and warmth and aren't like panicking about silly things like not being able to park their car in front of their house, like you were saying with the street ban you're dealing with, Normie, and just like things like access to material stability is way more impactful at scale right now than, you know, a patented, you know, modality of psychedelics.
Novel psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, look, and like I said on the last podcast that we just did, is that it sucks because then I end up coming across as it's like I'm anti-psychedelic. No, I'm really not. It's a tool. It's a potential tool that can be in the toolbox. There are tools that are magnitudes of order more important to deal with these things than taking a pill, going to a therapist, and then going back into the same environment that you were in. I think there's a need to repeat these things often because they're true. And also because all of these companies and organizations pretend they don't exist.
Sure. I mean, let's talk about like PTSD, depression, anxiety for a second. You know, these are they're conditions that are caused by things that have happened to you in life. And of course, your sort of general, so depression, for instance, there's research that says it can be heritable. One might assume the same for propensity to carry certain kinds of trauma or other, whether or not you're more resilient to it. Some of it's learned, some of it's ingrained, right? Well, essentially, it's good that there are tools to address these responses to the environment, to the expression of one's genes and neurodiversity or neurospecificity in this case. And yet there's the entire context in which a person's life plays out. And that is why I think we often get cast as like Debbie Downers or negative Nathans, because we point back to these broader systemic issues, and yet I fundamentally don't follow or understand, you know, people who want to take psychedelics and put them into a box or a clinic where you go in a broken person and you come out a functioning person, and ignore the system that is creating and perpetuating these breakages. Because
go ahead and Shay.
My main kind of concern is specifically about those organizations that are trying to use the most ruthless protocols and methodologies of advanced surveillance capitalism, and using this discourse about helping people and healing the planet. Like those two things just like
those
cannot go together. Like
they came together in that Forbes or Bloomberg article the other day that put Compass and Palantir rightly in the same sentence, that they were backed by Peter Thiel. I
mean, that's just where we are. Like
I saw something. It was a stock program that it was like some kind of visualization thing where maybe social networking for stock people, and the people who had the most investment in Compass Pathways, their second most likely stock to own was Palantir.
Yeah, that was on Robinhood.
That was it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and I mean also, like when we're talking about, let's say, surveillance capitalism in the space, like, Maps just announced that they're working. They're offering a partnership. They're working with a company called Free Will, where they're announcing that, hey, if you want to leave Maps money in your will, you can create a will for free via Free Will. The thing that they don't tell you is that Free Will is an actuarial prediction platform whose business model is predicated on selling subscriptions to nonprofits who they say, well, likely this will help get people contributing to you via donations through their will, but they also sell your data. They make your data available to those nonprofits that are subscribing so that they can see what your interests are, like what sort of people are likely to donate and to leave money in their wills to these nonprofits. And the fact that, what was that?
The profiles of like the types of people who are donating or not.
Right. And the fact is, like, we've reached out to other companies operating in psychedelia who are doing these data platforms. In one case, one of them vehemently denied that they were engaged in any sort of surveillance capitalism. And then I showed them their privacy terms, their data terms, that showed that they were selling data or using data for ad targeting and all of these other things. And suddenly it went from, oh, we don't engage in any sort of surveillance capitalism to, well, this is business in 2020. What could you possibly expect us to do? And I think that level of sort of blasé disregard for the realities of these situations, especially when we're talking about some of the most, I don't know, intimate, invasive, therapeutic experiences, right, being paired with this sort of data extraction and potential for behavioral modification and manipulation that really picks up in a more advanced ways on the old work of B.F. Skinner. It's incredibly alarming. And I think the fact that you had Rick Doblin on stage saying, oh, wearables, I don't really understand what these wearables are, but these companies are going to come in and use them. And don't worry about Peter Thiel. There's nothing to see here. He's probably not even interested in psychedelics. And now he's pouring in, $100+ million.
Not that interested.
But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, good. No, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, just to finish up on the material component real quick, like this notion, and with what Normie was saying earlier, I think that there's a real, it seems like it seems almost easy, right? It's easier, and to crib from Mark Fisher, right? It's easier to imagine psychedelic therapies solving the mental health crisis than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Sure. And Pace has also made comments about, oh, sorry, I just lost it.
It was good. No, I think the pivot from Mark Fisher's really really nice. So Mark Fisher,
except that I also really wanted to say something about free will. So, but I'll come back to free will after you do your pivot.
No, please.
Well, I just wanted to say, because there's a completely separate concern that I have about the free will situation, which is just that I was reading of the Forbes, I think it was article about the company and how it got started and the motivations behind it. And it said one of the founders was working for I think it was the DNC, like the Democratic Party. And he was like tasked with trying to find ways of basically increasing those like small dollar donations from like everyday folks and not the like obscenely wealthy people. And my concern is that structurally tools like this seem to be just another way of like squeezing the lower classes of wealth and moving it up now into this, whether it's the nonprofit industrial complex or whatever. But like my concern is that, and this is not something I don't think that the nonprofits raising money will care about, but if you have these really vulnerable people, some of whom might have mental illnesses and whatever else, and you're like, hey, you can just sign away your money when you die to this company, and you really want to feel like you're doing something meaningful. And just, to me, there's like a lot of space to take advantage of people, like and exploiting these new avenues of reaching deeper into the pockets of folks who like least have like the money to give. That's just kind of like a red flag for me.
Yeah, it's the kind of those people who, the people who are giving large amounts, I don't think that they need a free online will
right, because they're paying for this stuff to be done. So it's going to be the non-obscenely wealthy types that are taking advantage of this service. And I'm sure that there will be some connections for whom someone just like didn't want to go out of their way, but they're really happy and able to donate their money to MAPS. But there may be other people for whom like that money would have gone to the family who needs it, and like now suddenly it's been, like in my family there was someone who was really unwell and under like a conservatorship, and still somehow managed to like donate all of her money and all of her belongings to the Catholic Church. And then like, even though she was under conservatorship, like they went to court in the Catholic Church with their like mega lawyers were able to say like, yeah, no, she can give all her money. But like, there are people who like are not that, they're just easy to take advantage of basically. And it's just, to me, it's easier to do that if you're having a tool like this than it would have been when that barrier was there. So just something to think about.
I just want to make one point. I just wanted to make one point on when we were talking about mental health and ways to, that would kind of help out. How about, here's an idea. How about debt forgiveness? How about
COVID relief?
How about you want to talk about for a generation or two, alleviating anxiety? How about debt forgiveness on student loans? I can't imagine that. It's quite simple. No one's going to profit off that, though. That's unfortunately the problem there.
I was for a while, I was kind of thinking to myself, I've never like said this out loud, but I was thinking it'd be funny if like, well, for the psychedelic community to actually like walk the walk and support the traumatized like people like within the community, the people who are living paycheck to paycheck and have like $100,000 of student loan debt and were abused by bad actors in the community. Like, what if all this concern was like put towards like, oh, let's help out these people close at home who have been out there helping to make this conversation more possible and more accessible.
Well, that's
and really
actually
care
what happens
about
in a
that,
community, not in something that's just called a community.
Yeah. Yeah. Like to me, it's like, wouldn't it be cool if like there was this prioritization of like, just like people who were hurt from like people who were here and like, just like really wanting to make sure that those people were okay. Like, I just like the fact that that's not happening speaks to, I think, the priorities.
I think this brings us back to systemic kind of issues and ultimately the kinds of solutions that we're interested in. I think the reality is that the narratives around psychedelics and healing for things like PTSD and addiction and trauma, depression, OCD, general malaise, that kind of thing that people, childhood trauma, just whatever it is that people are talking about right now that psychedelics are going to solve, psychedelics are being put forth mostly as an end of the pipe solution, as I sometimes categorize things in this way. An end of the pipe solution is well, it's already done. It's already messed up. So let's see if we can get out the glue and the stitches and the sutures and fix it. And then the things that we're talking about here is like, well, what if there were ways to create better systems and societies so that these kinds of problems weren't being caused in the first place on such a mass scale? So this is stuff that like Dave gets flack for all the time. Like, oh, well prioritizing, or even just centering, veterans in particular, when like, look, any honest assessment of war making, veterans are people who make war and they do so at the behest of their nations and they become traumatized as a result. And the people that they drop bombs on, and I don't know, whatever era you're in, bayonet somebody, they are also traumatized. And so we are making decisions all the time about, who we center in our marketing materials, and B, who we invest in, and C, who becomes rich off of these things and who gets the first dose, the first session. And these are the rules of engagement that we spend some time talking about.
So Jim just said he fears we are getting thrashed by the use of words. And so I don't know if that's directed. I'm going to go ahead and assume that's directed at us sort of maybe getting too heady with things. But I think I can speak both to that and to some of the points Pace just made, in a sense that like, so if the question then comes back to what do we do and how do we orient, right? Sort of what are the projects, what are the material ways we can plug in? I think something that the community there's two things that I think that the community struggles with as much as they give it lip service. One is the shadow and the notion of shadow work. And I'm not going to focus on that right now. The other is integration, right? And for me, what I mean by that is less like, how do you work your psychedelic therapy into some way of better imagined wellness, and more of like, how do we make meaning and plug psychedelic values or what I might like to think of as like the sort of highest aspirational values psychedelic experiences might expose people to in ways that can actually bring about some of the systemic change. And I think the first point is probably a bit of a cliche, but this notion of like working locally, right? Rather than working to build the scaled golem, rather than working to build some sort of aggregate project where, okay, we're going to take all of the psychedelic people across the United States and plug them all into each other. And then once we
just
can have
the leaders,
right. We'll have the thought leaders at the top, and they're going to utilize the power of our collective psychedelic knowledge to build the sort of accelerator that's going to get psychedelic ideas to scale that can operate alongside of the pharmaceutical companies. Fuck that. Like the question that comes to mind is like, what are the projects in your immediate surrounding that you actually care about, you know, and things that, like, for me, I know on psychedelic experiences, I've had incredible connection to discrete local pieces of land, right? To the forests that are immediately accessible, to the natural parks that I've been fortunate enough at times to live behind, right? To certain people and projects that are focused on changing material conditions, thinking particularly about a Books to Prisoners project, where the sort of community that existed around that, as far as people who would show up for each other, not just to make the project happen, but then to support each other, to support the people that they got to know as a result of working on this abolitionist project. To me, I think one of some of the greatest resistance that type of psychedelic integration encounters is from folks in the psychedelic community who don't feel that it's psychedelic enough, right? It's not the spectacle of Burning Man. It's not some explicit psychedelic conference and gathering where everybody is putting their use on their sleeve and talking about, you know, the plumbing the depths of these experiences or engaging in some sort of navel gazing, but rather comes back to saying like, hey, I've had experiences that show me that my connection to other human beings and nature are incredibly important, and how do I put that to work in the real world? You know, going back to say like, and not to say that psychedelics offer enlightenment, I don't think they do at all, but the notion that before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. We live in the real world. We don't live in community by and large. So then what would it take to actually build up community and you know, sort of nurture those types of social relations?
I agree with that. I also I want to push back against like what could be interpreted as like all of those psychedelic meetings talking about experiences are just navel gazing, because there's like there's a place for that as well, you know.
I mean, there's like a lot of what the fuck is going on that has had to be unpacked. I mean, the fact of the matter is that psychedelics can bring insight, and they can also bring quite a bit of confusion. I think though that I think you both have like really important points to make. I mean, none of us would be talking about this if these weren't really complicated issues. And
I remember
they're pretty
the thing
simple.
from earlier.
What's that?
The point you make about prefiguring, or not prefiguring, but like working to build a world where it's increasingly difficult to have a bad trip.
Yeah.
Right. And what that looks like.
Yeah. I mean, look, I spent a long time thinking about things like development issues and global poverty. Did my PhD on climate change and like subsistence farmer issues. A lot of that dovetailed with ethnobotany, and that's kind of very parallel to some of the questions that are asked in like understanding psychedelics. The food, clothes, shelter question. To paraphrase something that's often said in development, and apply it to the psychedelic space. You need a psychedelic therapist, once every 6 years. You need a farmer 3 times a day. And so, the question about what we do with the 99% of the time, even those of us who've gone, hard into the test pilot zone and plumbed the depths, you're still going to the grocery store. You're still calling your mom, hopefully. Call your mom.
Wait, you haven't figured out how to photosynthesize yet?
Yeah.
Breatharians.
But like, this is why like integration and stuff has become a helpful narrative in the psychedelic spaces, is in part to like ground some psychonauts who've gone too far off, the beaten track. But also like, look, there are valuable insights that come from psychedelics. And if they're valuable, prove it. All right. If you're enlightened, cool, make the world better, end some fucking suffering.
I mean, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was McKenna who said like, I'm gonna butcher it, but it was something to the effect of like the point of psychedelics is to not have to take psychedelics.
Yeah.
Just speaking to your point on do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of problems to be solved, and if psychedelics are cognitive tools that have been rusting in the box, and now we're taking them out and we're polishing them up and we're getting them ready, let's get them ready to solve problems, real, concrete problems in people's lives. And on one hand, that's exactly the arguments of the medicalizers. They say, hey, you can't, like, this is an imperfect world, so we're just gonna deal with PTSD, and yet that's the same kind of complicity that has allowed doctors to be the richest members of society.
I mean, it's like advocating. It's like advocating for some kind of cancer drug, and then you don't say anything about the factory that's just a couple miles up the river that's shitting out all their pollution. and then we were pointing out, hey, that
factory there.
Plant.
Yeah.
How about that chemical plant there?
Bingo.
Well, so to that end, Dustin in the chat says, Field Trip has a partnership with wearable technology company Whoop to measure the biometric effects of ketamine therapies, also targeting veterans with PTSD in their pilot study. I'm pretty sure that's the base camp thing, right? Where they've highlighted first responders and military folks and the like. And there's a whole lot to be said, I think, first and foremost about ketamine therapy and the way that ketamine is being used to stake out territory for people who are eyeing sort of broader psychedelic therapies, but for the moment, ketamine is the only sort of the easiest way for them to get their foot in the door.
Build out that real estate infrastructure as well.
Totally. And, I think there's a couple things that I just would like to point out about ketamine and the way that it's being used. One is there's quite a few sketchy practitioners. I mean, and this is sort of across the board, whatever, like, and you can find it in, non-psychedelic medicine too. There was a podcast called Dr. Death dealing with like surgeon who, basically chops people up. There's all sorts of terrible people, no question. However, looking around some of the people playing fast and loose with ketamine, I mean, I know we were talking about Delic earlier. And frankly, like, I'm kind of shocked that this was public, but if you listen to a bunch of the Delic podcasts, you can see interactions between the founder of the company and her ketamine therapist, who in some episodes is basically doing on-air talk therapy that seems quite odd. But also then, you hear he's got his IV in while they're talking. Some of the ways that they're talking about what the ketamine is being used for or when it's being dosed. And I know for a fact, it's not just limited, like that's not the only practitioner who's playing fast and loose. I've gotten emails and messages from a bunch of people talking about some of the sketchy providers, how they're marketing it. And ketamine, even as they talk about how harmless it is. I mean, and I know I've brought up DM Turner before, who died in the bathtub as a result of ketamine.
Yes,
John Lilly struggled with ketamine, particularly later in his life. There are, Arrowhead has a section, there's not a ton of, deaths associated with it, but it does have an incredibly, it can have an incredibly habituating effect on people. And so
you can destroy your lower urinary tract system, which is not
the lining for your bladder. But looking purely at, so vulnerable people using a compound that can facilitate quite a bit of, if not dependence, at least like habituation, sort of moreness, and then combining that again with biometrics, combining that with wearables that are now processing information. I think most people don't realize what they're giving up when they sign these agreements. There's a lot of people who say, "Oh, look, it's all voluntary, it's all agreed on," but it's like when you get your Android phone or your iPhone and you go to use it, if you disable all of the features that require your personal information, you get no usability of the technology itself. And similarly, like you can't sign up for these programs or protocols that are partnering with wearables and participate in them without like giving up these chunks of data that in many ways we don't have good clarity about just how much it reveals. And we have good insight that very small packets of even, what do you call it? Not anonymized data, but the metadata. There we go. That even from metadata, in the case of like Facebook, whether or not you fill out a form tells advertisers more than what you actually fill out in the form in many cases. So there's a whole bunch of issues there, I guess.
And any of these companies that are talking about digital therapeutics or wearables, to track your before, during, and after psychedelics. Like the point, it's almost as like, and we've discussed this before, but psychedelics as an excuse for the vacuuming up of a wide range of,
and that should concern people.
Already understood biometric data and whatnot, but also potential novel uses of new types of behavioral data. One thing that's kind of been helpful to me as a way to sort of see it is that like, information data, it's a new commodity. There's just all these new, wells to tap. And, psychedelics combined with wearables are potentially just another well to tap. I'm sure that the data is going to be somewhat helpful in the treatment to some extent. I'm not saying that it's not, but I'm also saying that, and there's also valuable data to be mined there as well.
Well, and then also if you want to use it to push nutraceuticals or other, consumer bullshit, like this is one of the things, it sort of goes hand in hand, the use of microdosing, the reason we've seen all of these outfits, I mean, Cybin and a whole host of other corporadelic firms that are not just setting themselves up to engage in psychedelic therapy, but are also pushing nutraceutical lines. Like the notion that you're going to, on the one hand, you're promoting that you've got the cure for the, mental health crisis. And on the other, you're pushing Alex Jones brain pills, combined with some sort of wearable tracker. To me, it's just like
brand. It's a lifestyle, I mean, you've got your app-enabled ketamine snifter that monitors your text messages with your exes to make sure that you're not overindulging to manage your depression. It's fine. It's totally fine.
Yeah, you give it permission to kick you out of your messaging at the point where it detects that you might be more depressed than you think you are, which actually goes.
Wait, hang on. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting, but anybody in the chat have a question? All right, go on, Dave.
Yeah, fire away before we just ramble on about dystopian imagined futures. But one of the things, and I was reading, there was a debate between Steven Pinker and someone else where they were talking about some of the actuarial prediction and the futures. And
well, hold on, Steven Pinker is the guy who does the like life is better now than in history. So
is the guy,
yeah,
the guy with the beautiful
Steven Pinker
hair.
is the guy who says life is less violent now than it has been, over history, but also doesn't really engage much with like pre-civilization, and also doesn't speak about, like, he talks about interpersonal violence, but doesn't deal with state violence and like mass incarceration, or like the way that he defines violence, to my mind, is sort of very narrow and thin slicing. But if we consider, say, like, so he was talking about how, look, we know that human interviewees are fallible and that they don't always pick the best candidate. So instead, we should switch to pure AI, because that'll be able to go through and detect the best candidate. This comes back to the issues with, and I'm going to fuck up the name again, but Timnit Gebru, who was the AI ethics researcher who got bounced from Google. And the way that these AI data sets are constructed, they have huge blind spots, right? Because your AI data set is based on where you can pull AI data from. And if you have groups of people who are not plugged into the internet or active on certain media sites or wherever you're sucking that information up from, then they're effectively not represented in your data set. So the notion of handing it over, like, there's just so many potential ethical, not just blind spots, but like potentials for harm, potential for exclusion, potentials for lack of engagement or representation, that people, I think, get carried away in trying to correct human fallibility.
Yeah, there's an old saying in statistics that says all models are wrong, but some models are useful.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I was just thinking about the parallel to the protocols in Winners Take All, which is Anand Giridharadas' book about the thought leaders that we touch on in that forthcoming podcast. But he specifically gives one of the examples of, like, you have these capitalist consulting firms that are using these protocols to decide how to optimize global flows of capital, but an example of the blind spot, which is kind of like a metaphorical parallel to not having certain people represented in the data sets of the AIs, you end up with situations where they're like, oh, you can make this much more money delivering food in India by cutting out the middlemen. But he said the example that he used is like, but in that situation, what if the middlemen were the ways, even if it was like technically inefficient from like a capital spreadsheet perspective, what if those middlemen were how all of these like in between localities like got the food and things moved in the right way, that nothing was spoiling, and things that just weren't captured in that initial set of assumptions that these consultants are working with. There's an analogy there with the AI, just to give a kind of like framework for things, because when you say they're not included, like that's kind of like abstract. And so that to me is a helpful example of what it means to not be included. And the implication is that the conclusions aren't necessarily what you think they are.
Yeah, and you're speaking heresy to the managerial class, that they haven't, thought through all of these, all this minutia. Real quick, I noticed that, Hai Chin 13 has said, I think it's fair to speculate that any digital adjunct will add limited therapeutic benefit compared to the harm it would cause. And it just makes me think of Facebook. It's great that I can see, older members of other people's extended families, share memes. But, the harm done by this previous election, what happened in,
how about the harm done by being the biggest thief in the history of humanity? Like,
sure,
that's what Mark Zuckerberg is. He's stolen more information, private, like, things that people never consented to than any other human in humanity.
Have you guys been following the the kerfluffle between Facebook and Apple, just like what's going on there? Because I was just reading about this. I'm not like super educated, so don't like look into it yourself.
I thought you were a doctor.
not on Facebook. No, but I was reading that they Apple evidently with some new like phone platform is like trying to give options to phone users to like explicitly opt out, or like you have to like give permission for apps to follow you and like track all these things. And it's like it's such a threat to Facebook to have that, it's because it's like their business model depends on being able to track you in like all of these different dimensions. And so they took out like full page ads across the United States, like the New York Times, Washington Post, like, as this PR campaign to try to pressure Apple into rescinding that power from their users. And what's so interesting is that they're using this propaganda of, it's for the little business in your town that's suffering from COVID needs to have that targeted information to be able to advertise. And they're having this campaign where they have all these small business owners like saying, if it weren't for small business, but that's not what they care about. They care about hoovering your data. Like and the fact that they're so desperate that they're putting out all these front page stories, paid full page ads about it is because it's so essential that they have that scale data set to be able to get out that it's that important,
Well, and this is the same, and this is extractivism, right? Like this is the same way that when we talk about like oil or petrochemicals, right? When we see the tar sands and we see fracked gas, like at a point where your sort of traditional fuel sources become harder and harder to source, right? You start looking for alternatives because ultimately you need, in the case of industrial civilization, right? You need petrochemicals at this point to like make the thing work. Well, when we look at surveillance capitalism, that raw data, mining that from us, right? We're not the product, right? There's this line about, right, if you're getting a product for free, you are the product. The reality is we are the raw materials for the product, which is then these targeted advertisements that are sold to companies who are looking to place ads. And so the reason we see these skirmishes is it's precisely because there is a need to secure our data as a resource to then make the whole thing work. It's also the same reason why we're seeing denser and denser sort of collection. So like your phone, right? It has gyroscopes in it, so they can measure your gait, right? Mindstrong has talked about using that as far as one of the ways that they can figure out are you walking the way you walk when you're happy or sad? They've got barometric sensors. They've got barometers,
by the way.
Huh?
That's called gait analysis, by the way.
So they've got barometers in it, right? So that they can tell like what level of a shopping mall you're on, so that they could down the line send you targeted ads based on the stores that are on that level of the mall, right? And so this is part of the reason why I feel particularly concerned about the data richness of psychedelic therapy, but also as much as we see extractivism on that level, going back to the example Nishay made about the protocols and about when you've got people who are transporting food across rural villages and it's not economically efficient according to, let's say, the protocols or the market logic of capitalism, but that's how certain people engage in communal connection, sourcing food staples they wouldn't otherwise have in the rest. It's recursions of colonialism. I mean, it's the same way we've seen, for example, like the British coming in to certain locales and saying, the way you're growing rice here makes no sense whatsoever. This isn't efficient. We can maximize rice output, but you guys, you flood this field and then you drain that field. And no, we can have these fields going 24/7. And then they try it and the ecosystems collapse. And suddenly you have mass starvation. And, again, like just because something looks efficient on paper, I think there should be a huge question, and back to Haitchen's point about the harms it would cause versus the benefit, like what's the point of doing this in the first place? Like, is it serving the patient populations? Can you demonstrate, especially in the case of, say, Field Trip or any of the, or Mindset, or these companies claiming that they've got novel psychedelics that they're going to pair with digital therapeutics. And
that sounds good, Dave. I want to invest.
J.R. Ron just said that the new custom tailored psychedelics combined with digital therapeutics,
the drugs of the future plus the tech of the future.
There you go. Boom. When are we having our IPO?
This is why
fuck up.
it's perfectly reasonable to talk about, colonialism in regard to these giant plays where they're trying to take over a huge swath of a market. They're trying to roll something out that will affect millions of people, and yet they have their cross purposes. It's not just the profit motive, it's what the next thing they're going to invest in. It's what they're already invested in. And the idea of a one size fits all model for all of these people who come from different backgrounds, who have particular issues. We've already seen this as an issue that's been raised in psychedelic therapy that says, look, the PTSD therapy that's being approved by the FDA, is this even going to work for communities of color? Is it going to work if there aren't, people who come from those communities administering these substances? Well, we don't have that data. We don't have those data at all. And so, when you then add to it a private company who, by definition, their first priority has to be turning a profit every quarter, to pretend like they're going to be choosing something that puts patients' needs first is sadly laughable.
Yeah, I think there was what was it, about 80 million people who currently don't have health care or are underinsured or have a gap. I think it was something like 80 million people. Yeah. So yeah, the notion that this is going to be some scaled fucking,
But it doesn't have to be,
wonder
right?
drug.
If we're talking about public companies, and if we're talking about investors, and if we're talking about profitability, right? There's sort of two things. There's one, can you create, some sort of value for investors versus can you create an actual effective psychedelic therapy that scales, right? Those are actually two separate questions. And looking at Uber, for example, looking at the fact that Uber was, has only been viable because it's getting huge cash infusions. And yet, and it just, and part of its business model would require going fully autonomous, right? So
they did just sell off that division. So I don't know.
Exactly. They just sold their autonomous division.
But they did pump in a lot of money to it too. I haven't looked too far into it. Looks like they might be hedging a little bit there. I'm not entirely sure.
Sure. And there was also, some people asserted that the way that they got this, I think it was $3 or $4 billion from the Saudis, which is also so that there was questions about whether or not Uber was effectively being used to launder Saudi money. But this comes back to the conversations we've had about WeWork before, right? Where in order for WeWork to have been profitable, their projections were based on treating, I think, as Russ pointed out earlier in a recently recorded episode, that every single desk in a city, every worker at a desk was viewed as their addressable market. And we know that that's just not true. That's not a real, you're never going to hit that. So there is no real workable model there. So then if we consider,
it looks great on paper.
For sure. And so similarly too, if we imagine Uber, right, currently relying on all of these narratives about, look, it's the gig economy. We create options for workers who they get to do all this flexible stuff. And even if we set aside the, what was it, I-220, whatever initiative just got passed in California about not giving them basic workers' rights,
which they pumped in 200 million for that, 200 million plus for that.
Totally. So looking at the fact that their model hinges on cutting out all of the drivers who they're currently using as a narrative as to why they're an effective company. When we consider some of these psychedelic companies and we consider the press release statements they're making and we consider the way they're puffing themselves up, what's narrative bullshit versus what's actually demonstrably true, you know, looking on paper, none of these companies have anything to show. Like they've got IP, sure, but we know that we're looking at a time frame where there's going to be a whole bunch of shit that has to play out. There's likely going to be quite a bit of consolidation that takes place, you know, as people struggle to get raises, or, you know, as we see little components of bubbles pop. We're also going to see huge, like at the moment, we're seeing quite a bit of a skyrocketing as people are playing with some of the narratives about decrim. So, you know, like, I think going back to Nishé's comments earlier about what stories are being told and how they hold up and how they track to the real world and what we're trying to do, I think all of that needs to be scrutinized.
There's not necessarily, like with the music, like as an example, I think Mendel Kalin's talked about this in presentations and stuff, where music means something differently to each person based on their own experiences. Like a grandma listening to death metal during a trip might be really different from someone who has been going to live death metal shows all their life. You know, it's not something that necessarily like should be 100% standardized at scale. And I know that Mendel Kalin's company, WavePath, is it? Something like that, is trying to like have AI kind of tailored music to support the experience. But I still think that aiming for this mass standardization isn't necessarily like it's scalable and you can establish like market dominance, but it's not necessarily in people's best interest to have a one size fits all kind of approach to these things. And I was thinking back to the Vice article by Shayla Love, where it says the title is "I went to a high-end psychedelic retreat to address my anxiety." And this has always stood out to me because it's like she traveled around the world to go to this retreat center and was kind of like someplace she didn't know, in a country that she didn't know. She was like, just got off the plane and all the stress of traveling. And then she had a really difficult experience. And it says that like, I felt dizzy and panicked. At one point, I opened my eyes and saw Adam sitting next to me. It must have been obvious that I was distressed because he put his hands over me, not touching me, but doing Reiki, which was like part of the protocol there. It felt hot, painful, and I didn't like it. I tried to push his hands away and he told me to breathe and lean into it. This had to be the opposite effect of being calmed. I became frantic and it was suddenly urgent for me that someone else sit with me instead of him. So it's like they had this Reiki protocol. It's if someone gets distressed and you come over and you do Reiki, and like if they resist it, just encourage them to embrace it. And like clearly that wasn't working well for this person, you know, and just like the being out of her normal life in this like strange place with strange people that were trying to do things in this particular way, like really weirded her out. And it didn't seem like it was the most supportive circumstances that she could have been in. And so to me, I think of that example as just like a one little version of what can go wrong when you're trying to have this like standardized protocol that you're just like running people through.
Yep, setting them up, knocking them down. That was at Synthesis in the Netherlands. For those of you wondering where all that happened, Shayla Love's experience. And you know, I think that you know, for the communities that have traditionally used psychedelics, like they have you know, certain rituals, but even among those, you know, if we're talking about say peyote culture or something, there are different skill levels and different sort of reputations and styles of practitioners and ceremony leaders, and that's good. Like I understand a science-based approach, and it's good to submit psychedelics to rigor. Nobody on this call is anti-science. I think that we're actually all people who have a lot of respect for facts. We want to know, you know, what's going on, but that does extend to the context in which all of this is playing out. And you know, the facts are that the current medical you know, environment leaves a lot of people behind. And that's an issue. You know, so psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, like for those for whom it works, that's great. Like we're not saying that is bad and that people shouldn't receive care. Even soldiers and veterans and whoever has issues, that's great. What we've consistently said publicly and on podcasts, on the record, is that, you know, if you want to see a medical professional, with psychedelics, great. But strategies that like preclude anyone else from using these substances in a way that suits them, that should be resisted. Because first of all, like, how do we know that the current standard of care is the best thing? The fact of the matter is that psychedelic medicalization stands on the shoulders of a whole bunch of underground experimentation that didn't just stop because they got it through the FDA. Not that they did, but they're
and there's also questions about what protocols have gotten through, and what has we were talking about the issues with capitalism earlier, right? And who has written the protocols? Why are the protocols that are being used the protocols at hand? What improvements have been suggested? I mean, this is one of the things that I find so concerning about 109 out in Oregon, right, where they've effectively, and it's so fascinating to see all these folks talking about, legal therapy. They've called it services. It's services, and there was opposition from like the Oregon Psychiatrics Council or something like that was saying specifically, like, we don't legalize therapy through voter measures, right? We do that through the FDA. And when we look at some of the practitioners, and when we look at the abuse that has gone down in the world of sanctioned psychedelic therapy, the notion that somehow that is the place for this work to be done, the notion that somehow that safeguards against the things that can and have gone wrong in the underground. Again, the narratives don't match the actually existing histories and present. And looking at some of, Nishay was talking about Shayla Love's experience. To me, and I think some people might say it's overblown to cast it like this, but to me, there's a certain authoritarian dynamic in somebody saying, "Hey, I'm not cool with this," and then saying, "No, this is what you need."
I was thinking the same thing.
Right. So actually, though, that authoritarian vein runs really deep in a lot of in certain psychedelic lineages, and we've got some projects that are in the background that will hopefully be coming to fruition this year, or this upcoming year, that I'm really looking forward to sharing, and will hopefully present some really nice harm reduction. But when we look at the folks who have stewarded this, when we look at the types of mindsets, and particularly that sort of control from the practitioner, and the sense that they know best, and that, if we compare, let's say, that approach versus like the Leo Zeff method of, put on the blindfold and, the headphones and just go in and sort of trust yourself. And we could do Dr. Spock, right? Trust yourself, more than you think you do. But, at the end of the day, there's no one to mediate between you and your neurochemical system. Like, at the end of the day, it's you, your experience, how you make sense of it. Having somebody who can comfort you there makes a lot of sense, whether we're talking retreat or therapy. But at the end of the day, like, the notion that the person who's there to comfort you and help you, get through and work through the things is now going to be adding additional layers of stress. Or earlier, when Pace mentioned, psychedelic therapists, and this is something we've brought up before, the question of, does it make sense to have dedicated psychedelic therapists? Does it make sense to have people who essentially get to play, psychiatric shaman, rather than having quality therapists who occasionally pull psychedelics out as a tool for those patients they have who need it? Rather than
talking
seeing
about, I'm a penicillin doctor. I administer penicillin. And have you seen how well penicillin works?
Is that because of you?
Well, that's beside the point. I mean, I do know the correct time and the kinds of conditions that we want to use for penicillin, and it saves lives. Okay, so
can't argue with that.
Penicillin.
But I think, that's a point that we've brought up, right? Nishay, sorry, did you want to?
Go for it.
I couldn't tell whether you were laughing or looking to jump in. But that's just it, right? And yeah, sure, there are people look, there are people who have extensive experience with psychedelics, and I've heard people argue that as a result of that, they absolutely should be in this sort of specialist role. I know for a fact that some of those people have blown people out of the water, like in wholly inexcusable ways. People who are held in reverence by certain members or sections of the community, people who are authors on papers and who have quite a bit of name recognition, who have in certain cases treated people underground. When they found them to be resistant, they've said, oh, that just means you need more medicine. So here, I'm going to give you more medicine to push through the resistance. And they have overdosed people to horrifying degrees. And then those people wind up back with their primary care providers, in some cases, people who themselves are qualified, or have experience administering psychedelics in therapeutic contexts. And now their primary care provider has to pick up the pieces. And the fact that this is a dynamic that exists amongst licensed professionals in the space, to me, is flabbergasting. I mean, I'm curious if stories like that were kind of brought to light, if there was awareness of that, what the response would be more generally. Beyond the sort of, hey, you guys need to keep this under the rug because it's a bad look for the society or for the community as a whole. We can't let people know that this happen.
So Kenya McRae has a question. Did you guys know that Fluence 8 has now started a certificate program for psychedelic integration, and its estimated cost is $10,000?
Aren't they the ones who are advertising with Lucid?
All over Lucid, yeah.
Yeah,
so it's a cash grab.
It's a cash grab. Yeah, they're trying to find money for that. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not for, I don't know, it's definitely not in the interest of like helping the average person right now. It's like a niche kind of prestigious thing for, I'm sure that they're getting people to enroll, but it's definitely like not intended for the average person to
who is Fluence involved with too? Have we looked into them and who is kind of
isn't that the one that what are their names who are involved in that?
Nielsen.
Yeah. So folks who are involved with NYU and Horizons, so people who have been in the field for a long time, they're not just like swooping out of nowhere.
No, but I think that they have recognized an ability to. So yeah, it's Dr. Elizabeth Nielsen, Ingmar Gorman, Jeffrey Guss, Casey Paleos.
Yeah, so those are folks who have been like in the field for a really long time and are adapting now to all of this like potential to raise capital, because you couldn't do that a few years ago, to charge that much.
Right. And I mean, so this is a fundamental issue with the professionalization of, psychedelic sitting and psychedelic integration, which, by the way, is called talking about that trip you had. So like, I'm assuming these doctors have medical bills to pay, or medical school tuition to pay, loans.
Look, this is the price. That's kind of the price that these programs are going for, as well. There's a variety of them that are out there now.
It's school, and I mean,
yeah,
you get a certificate. The question really becomes, in a new field, will it be recognized in any kind of like, and not only will it be recognized, but is it useful? Is it useful to the people who've gone through it, and is it useful to the people who they will serve?
We don't know about like the specifics of what they're offering or how they're structured. You're just speaking generally about what integration means, and so I just wanted to caveat that we like haven't like studied the content that they're offering.
But I did preface what I was saying by saying this is one of the issues with the professionalization of psychedelics, in the sense that, like, look, I mean, it's helpful. It is helpful to bounce an intense experience off a knowledgeable person's head and gain some reflection, to have someone who is skilled at regulating their nervous system well enough so that you can dysregulate your own for a bit and process some intense stuff. I'm not going to say that that's not valuable. That's the heart of therapy generally. But yeah,
sure.
To Dustin in the chat, I think that the MAPS program was around that same price the last time that I checked.
And the CIIS one I think was 7,000. It may have jumped up since then. There was a question from Jonathan Kaplan earlier.
There was just one other thing I wanted to say to that. So it looks like it's a 120-hour program. Mm-hmm. Right. And if you compare that even to like a semester for like a 15 credit hour semester, that seems, high, depending on where you're at. But even beyond that, I guess the question is like, what is the certificate good for? Like in Australia, there's a company called Mind Medicine Australia that's offering a certificate program that it's a piece of paper. I mean, there are integration coaches who are offering. There's one who offers an integration coach training for $6,789 because 6, 7, 8, 9. Why not? But again, like just because you get a certificate, like, does that certificate allow you to practice? Does it come with like, what is there oversight? Is there, and going into the professionalization, like if there's now a certificate, and again, I'm speaking purely speculatively, but like, let's say you get your Fluence certificate and you go register with the Psychedelic Medicine Association or whatever, and now you've got these various sort of industry staples. You can put that all on a website and say you're an integration coach that has this certificate and this, that, and the other. But is there accountability with that? Is there actual is there meaningful or is it a sort of pseudo professionalization where you have all of these signposts without a whole lot of substance?
You've got the coaching certificate,
right? Is it a line on your CV, or as David said, does it come with some kind of standard of care? And I think that's a valuable question, because like, look, I've been through so much education that I can't say that education isn't valuable. At least it should be. And that, people shouldn't be paid for providing that education. I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying that if we leave it to the professionals only, psychedelics will become very expensive. And right now, I believe they're accessible, at least in that respect. Nishay, what you got?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say also, like with CIIS, the California Institute for Integral Studies, like recently we took a look, some of us, at a recent PhD dissertation that was filed. And I was looking at also you can basically, like I graduated from UPenn, which is like really prestigious and pays all of their PhD students. And I'm just kind of like comparing like what they offer, like, and then like I came out of that with like a really solid fucking education. It's like I can close read anything you put in front of me, and like just looking at this dissertation, it was intellectually vacuous. Like it was completely vapid, and there were like holes in the logic. And it's like, if you're raising money if you have a spare $100K, you can get a PhD from the school, and then the quality of like what they're actually offering isn't substantially rigorous. Like it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And that's what they're doing for their PhD students. Like, do you necessarily trust that this money-making kind of operation is going to be leading to incredible outcomes at other levels of certificate or degree? So I think that incentive to raise money, might encourage just kind of like taking the people who have the money and then giving them credentials to do what they will.
The and Trump also how University much of this model of psychedelic integration. Real quick, Jonathan Kaplan.
Yeah, I know you want to, before you get to that question, I just want to deal with the one we were on. Just all of these framings and questions sort of railroad us into medicalization. This sort of professionalization, these courses, the medicalization around it, like we frequently wind up talking about issues of medicalization and corporatization because that's the way that the discourse is getting shaped. And I just like to take a moment and sort of earmark it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be like in a decrim context, the notion that people could use psychedelics for whatever the hell they want, just sort of having the experience, playing in nature, sitting quietly and meditating, going to enjoy a show, what have you. And the way that there's this sort of encroaching like hegemonic discourse around medicalization, where it becomes this question of, is this course legitimate? Is that course legitimate? Rather than saying like, hey, in some cases too, reading people post online and saying, I've always loved psychedelics. It looks like the only opportunities to get involved are through, medical or therapeutic applications. Where do I go to get a medical degree? It's like, well, hold on. If you just want to play with drugs, like that's cool. Like just go play with drugs. Don't force that on someone else. Or seeing, for example, I'll just put it out there. One of the people involved with North Star on their social media from like 2 years ago was taking a coaching training, and they posted on their Instagram their coaching handbook, session 2 or something. And somebody chimes in and says, oh, what are you training to be a coach for? Oh, I don't know. I haven't figured out my niche yet. I'll get it sorted, at some point. Fast forward like 6 months and suddenly they've got a psychedelic integration coaching website. Yeah. And like, to me, that's absurd. And that comes, again, that sort of seems like fallout of this hegemonic approach to talking about, psychedelics as medical rather than sort of the full package. Sorry, we can get to Jonathan Kaplan. I wasn't trying to.
No, I mean, I think it's just, it's a fair question, and is, it's not the sort of stuff that we typically trade in, but hey, let's do it. Like, is microdosing valuable as a general therapeutic method? Or is it a significant dose, the cornerstone of effective experience with psychedelics? Nishay.
Also, hi, John. You were punting that to me.
Take it. You're in the hot seat.
I'm not really like the microdosing person. I'm like,
what?
Do any of us have like
microdosing coach?
I need a coach here.
Go on. Then if you're not a microdosing person, then
I do feel like microdosing is a thing that's different from like taking a heavy dose, and like I'm not clear. I've heard a lot of good things from people who've like done it and have a semi-reliable, very sub-threshold, but like energy boost and stuff. And as someone who was on Adderall for many years, like that was really helpful for me. And people describe similar type benefits from microdosing that I think are entirely plausible, but not having done it and like not being clear, how much impressionability or like, I don't know, like there's not a ton of evidence about what's actually going on. Like we have examples of like homeopathy and stuff where people are like really convinced that there's some effect that they're feeling, but like science is saying maybe not. So like I don't personally know. I just know that I've heard positive things from people who have like been able to have microdosing practices. I don't know anything. Do you guys know more? Like
anybody got a positive microdosing experience?
I just know that every time I've ever tried, it's ended up bigger than I meant to.
You're doing it wrong. You need a coach. All right. I will say, I will go on the record and say that microdosing has been like useful for me. I definitely have microdosed on and off for many years, and whether it's placebo or not, I don't.
Why did you punt the question to me? You're like, I have so much experience to describe the answer.
Like, I was trying to put you in the hot seat. First of all, we're doing round robin here. So I mean, like microdosing, is it placebo? Maybe. I personally don't think so, partly because like what Russell just said, I often overshoot the mark. I have overshot the mark. I have been a little too sparkly when I probably did not intend to be.
Museum dose.
Can I just say what the last time I tried to do this, I was like driving down the road and I was like, man, my hands are really coming into focus right now on the steering wheel. And I was like, I need to go home.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's that kind of stuff is all over the place with, the self-reports of microdosing and such.
Fadiman or Stamets protocol was the question.
Fadiman. I think so. I mean, in my much higher dose range experimentations, I learned very quickly that you cannot go big 2 days in a row. You cannot go big 3 days in a row unless you, well, have a lot and you keep doubling the dose, and then things get pretty weird. Tolerance develops very quickly. So honestly, I really have never understood why Stamets, a guy who like should know his shit, is saying take psilocybin in a small amount every single day. It doesn't make any sense. It also is like, you know, he's like, and take some lion's manes that I sell along with it. It doesn't, there's just no, like, look, the Fadiman protocol, if you're going to even just like follow how the neurochemistry of these like 5-HT2A agonists work, the idea that you might need a little bit of a break does make sense. Personally, though, in terms of protocols, even the Fadiman protocol, which people forget, it's like 10 weeks. You do it on, and then after that, what does the Fadiman protocol say? Anytime you feel like it, you know. So
I think the dichotomy of like microdosing versus macrodosing, I think the whole thing is stupid. Personally,
what's a macrodose? I don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
It's called taking drugs.
A made-up word.
It's like you want to smoke a blunt, smoke a blunt. You want to take one bowl hit, take a bowl hit. Whatever. So, if it works for you, it works for you.
So I will say that the microdosing like discourse, I think it's really, I think it is a positive thing. Just like apart from all of the like crazy bullshit that's been attached to it, I think that it's given people permission to dip their toe in the water. And I think from a harm reduction perspective, it's a really positive thing, because I think a lot of people have had their first introduction to psychedelics being like just chucked into the deep end. And maybe there's a little bit of sort of, I don't know, hazing like feeling where we, you know, those of us who got chucked into the deep end, I certainly did, think that that's the way everybody should do it. I don't believe that. I think that if you want to do a museum dose, you know, which is, you know, where your wood grain is flowing and things are sparkling, but you can still keep your shit together in public, and you want to get comfortable with that before you know, really go into some mythopoetic like mental state. I think that's good. Why not?
You've made me feel so many different things.
Good.
Yeah. So first I want to, because we've brought up Fadiman and sort of, I just want to throw out this Jim Fadiman quote from a talk where he said, "One of the things I've liked about microdosing is it has not led to any political positions at all." So, you know,
what a weird specific quote.
so right. Well, and I'd scooped that a while back. And also when I hear you talk about sort of getting thrown into the deep end, I will admit that like being a nerd prior to being a drug nerd, and also not having people to throw me into the deep end, like I kind of tiptoed in that, like, you know, I spent weeks doing research, had the shrooms, and was then like, okay, cool. Like I have a sense of where.
Yeah, you're a fucking nerd.
Yeah, I know.
I bought this shit off the street, like in Portland.
Well, so okay, so the thing that I guess I'd also like to point out is, like, by definition, right, microdosing is supposed to be sub-perceptual, right? Like if you're feeling things, you've already
sub-visually perceptible, and I have that on good authority.
Okay? Yeah.
Mood elevation is
sure. And so like the notion that there might be some therapeutic effects there, okay. I think also therapeutic can be a kind of vague descriptor, right? Like as far as what
back
is
to the question,
right? Like, and are you looking to like work through sort of maybe wind up reliving and then deconstructing like early childhood trauma? A microdose probably isn't going to do so much. If you're looking to, you know, have some mood elevation, and maybe like for me, I've never had experiences worth discussing, like taking the sub-visually perceptual doses. Like,
I would agree with that.
And I have I have a friend who he and I like to joke, if you know, with regards to psychedelics and placebo, and especially like on the come up where you're not sure how strong something is and you're talking, do you feel it yet? If it's a maybe, it's a no. You know, it just
that's
just,
before you get to +3.
right.
Sorry, we should just start a podcast name. So
and so so I think like around that question, like I certainly wouldn't yuck anybody's yum if microdosing is what makes them happy. And also, if we look at the way microdosing, and part of the reason I started with the Fadiman quote is because for me, my biggest objection to microdosing is less about people's personal relationships with it or effects, or if that's how somebody sort of, you know, if you think about it almost like an allergy test of, I don't know how I'm going to react to LSD or to whatever. So I'm going to start out with like, you know, a quarter of a blotter and slowly work my way up just to see what happens. I would never knock that. However, when we look at the sort of socio-cultural discourse around it, and we see the Silicon Valley phenomenon and this notion of, oh, well, microdose to be better at coding, microdose to improve your workflow and your focus and your productivity. To me, like, this is the same as mindfulness meditation and yoga as the first 15 minutes or half hour of work. I used to do executive assistant work for a guy out in the Bay Area who their team started every day with a mindfulness meditation. And like, to my mind, the notion of using these things to promote like worker proficiency or whatever, like, it's just not, like, to me it makes perfect sense that at the point where the microdosing narrative got traction, that's when it started to get more, we started to see psychedelics getting more social validity, right? That there was this, suddenly it wasn't just that like psychedelics were a boundary dissolving experience that, you know, might leave you at total odds with the established socioeconomic order, but actually they could make you a more productive drone. And like that, to me, when I look back at my first psychedelic experience, which was immersive enough that, like, you know, there was some really profound spiritual moments, some really meaningful political realizations as well. Going back to the Fadiman quote, like, for me, psychedelics have been so meaningful precisely because there was that inherently political component to them and a recognition of being plugged into this whole web of life.
So, okay. So I'm going to continue playing the devil's advocate here because, like, look, I agree with most of your like social, like, for God's sakes, the discourse around microdosing, like I've said in front of like audiences, it is the most palatable way for psychedelics to be brought into the capitalist framework. So we agree. Okay. Whether or not it's placebo, like, I really don't think it's placebo. Okay. And N equals 1 over here, but like I microdosed a lot, and like it's different than like being sober or drinking too many cups of coffee, right?
Would you consent, like, if you, like, let's say you had some doses and someone was and you knew that like a quarter of a blotter was subvisually perceptible, would you consent to, or if you had drops and somebody could dilute them for you, would you consent to somebody like basically doing double blind random or even blinded sort of randomized testing where, you know, maybe in your morning glass of water, your partner went ahead and dosed you, right? Like, we could actually test some of this.
Dave's pitching it. We have this and we're ready to go.
I believe that some of these tests have been done in the EU on a very small scale. But, you know, from the, so Sophia Korb, Dr. Sophia Korb is somebody who has worked very carefully with Jim Fadiman, you know, looking at these surveys and such. And she thinks that it's not like Adderall. It's not going to help you put together a carburetor the right way better. And it's not like taking a big dose where it's going to help you think of wildly different divergent thinking. But that it might help from switching from those two different modes of cognition, from it's more smoothly from convergent thinking to divergent thinking. Regardless,
and there's been at least one peer-reviewed study that showed like time dilation, like sense of time change. Like, there are things that, according to the very limited studies, do seem to. And
apparently, you know, as microdosing came to the conversation, you know, more sort of stamina and or extreme like climbers and such. So, oh yeah, that like surfers in California and stuff. Oh, that, yeah, I've done that, and I will validate some of those things as well. I'm a pretty physical guy, and I've noticed a difference in performance on the times that I have had that. That said, after all of this time, being the lone person willing to defend microdosing from the Psymposia team.
That's not true. I didn't attack it. I was kind of a
I don't have any issue with it.
I don't have any problem with it. I just can't speak to it.
I would like the
Dave's the microdosing.
I don't have a problem with the practice. I would like the narratives to go, like the broad social narratives to go away.
Yeah,
partly because like I think microdose coaching and the like is clearly predatory.
Who the fuck needs a coach?
I think there's also probably bipartisan support there.
Of consciousness. No one.
Yes.
But that's just it. It's like if you need a microdose coach, you probably also need a coach to just like go about your daily life, because it's not.
The physical thing you said, Brian, is interesting because the one person I know who has been really into microdosing said like what he did on it was go work out at the gym. Like that's like what he did before he went to the gym each week. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to do that, I guess.
Right.
It wasn't microdosing, but I knew guys who in college would take acid because they found that it enhanced their drinking capacity.
Oh yeah, it keeps you awake.
And they would just.
There's one. The question though was general therapeutic model, and I will say I have met one veteran who said that a quarter of hit of LSD weekly eliminated his suicidal ideation, and I'm not going to tell him he's wrong.
No, totally.
Oh, cool. That's my opinion on it. If you think it works for you, cool. Yeah.
Well, and that's just it. I think for individuals figuring out their substances, and like I'm not gonna, if somebody decides that they like to have a near beer, and just sipping on that because they enjoy the taste and they enjoy like it gives them some sort of social buzz. Again, like I'm not gonna knock anyone's personal use. It's more a question of, are you then attaching some sort of like propagandistic narrative to that, and who does that serve?
Yeah, to make better trinket or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Because we need better trinkets.
All right.
Always.
So significant doses. Are we for significant doses here? Do we need bigger doses?
That's what
again, my opinion.
I know the late Calindia was
my opinion's like the same. I mean, I think
peace.
Terrence McKenna's 5 grams thing. I think that's dangerous actually to be promoting. I've done it, and it was wonderful.
Oh
no, of course not. It was terrible and wonderful. But I don't recommend whatsoever for someone who hasn't done it before to do that. I don't support that at all.
I think that kind of pushes against that idea of standardization as well, and of only being able to do it one way, because again, I've done really tiny doses and very large doses, and it's kind of just been situational and what felt right at the time. And I don't want someone to tell me what dose size to take, because like my experience is affected by how, like what I take is because I'm feeling that way at the time, or what I feel comfortable with.
At the same time, the Hopkins research and some of the clinical trials, they're up there at around 5 grams or so, aren't they? 4 to 5.
Yeah, some of them. In terms of
milligrams.
general strength of psilocybin mushrooms in the milligram.
Sure, I mean, and it's also in a somewhat controlled environment as well. It's different between going in your closet, shutting the lights off, and taking 5 grams as well.
Well, okay, and there's like around that, like Kalindi's comments, we need higher doses. Again, I think the question is for what end, to what end, and he was certainly a unique character. I think whether we're talking 5 grams or 50 grams, advocating that into the general public, there's questions about that just because of the kind of research people do or don't do, which I'll circle back to in a second. But like also with McKenna advocating 5 grams at a point where, he'd had his meat locker experiences and was essentially like, not dosing. To me, like, to be throwing that out cavalierly without sort of disclaiming some, like,
there.
yeah, exactly. And so, and about the research, so I've moderated the DMT Nexus for a number of years, and seeing people who would accidentally overdose themselves on homebrew ayahuasca, particularly with Mimosa hostilis root bark, because sites would have, would say 15 grams when, in reality, maybe 3 to 5 would do you. And you wound up having people who had massive, massive doses. I mean, I've also taken quite large doses of pharmawaska and other things. And like, some of them were simultaneously terrifying and beautiful. And like, I don't know that I would do them again, but I'm also kind of grateful for having those experiences. I don't know, in some cases, like, that they served, let's say, a therapeutic purpose. In some cases, sure, there were definitely things worked through. I think there is, for me, like, there are sweet spots where it's like, I like an immersive experience. I like, not only because of like the visual content, but also because of the mental component. I mean, it's one of the reasons I don't really like 2CB all that much, because I don't find there to be a whole lot going on mentally. So there's not a lot of self-reflection or sitting and like working through different things, even just like more conceptually, if it's not like a personally therapeutic, whatever. But to me, like, and I've said this, when I've been at festivals with folks and people are talking about what drugs they're doing and why, or people are talking about, just wanting to get kind of sub-perceptually or just like barely visually altered. And it's like, I like the weird. Like, I like, like when I was at Burning Man or elsewhere, like for me, I really like getting altered and going to see the weird art creations that people have pulled out of their mind, and sort of getting that mishmash of weird that gets thrown back at you, and then realizing that, somewhere in there it ties back to some childhood memory, and then suddenly, an ecstatic gasp of realization that, oh shit, this is why, I've been reactive to this thing for the last, sort of surprise therapy even that can come from those deeper, more immersive things, right? That, oh, I'll just go for a nice recreational experience, and this is why you're dealing with that. And I don't think that that's necessarily, in my experience, it hasn't been likely in lower doses. I have found that low dose mescaline has been phenomenal. From that, in my experience, mescaline has far less likelihood than, say, tryptamines for the thought loops, and like, particularly at the lower doses where there's a whole lot of empathic opening, but not a whole lot of like confusion or perturbation. And so being able to sort of feel into, and again, we're still talking well beyond microdose. We're talking somewhere between like museum and moderate dose, let's say, where there's quite a bit of material that can be worked with, but also just the ability to like, enjoy the mental states that come up. I saw that comment. I said,
so Jake Elijah Payne
check out our store next week.
You guys would all make great psychedelic coaches. We give out our information for free, so that makes it a non-excludable product, and so we're terrible capitalists.
They can be good coaches and bad capitalists, although we don't endorse the coaching
We've
model.
described a whole bunch of these like moments on a curve, a dose response curve, and I believe, like, I map some of this back to Jim Fadiman's The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, but I'm sure he was borrowing from discourse that had been around for a long time. But basically like microdose, mini dose, museum dose, socio emotional dose, transpersonal dose. And I think that the widest,
I'm surprised he didn't call it the political dose. I mean,
yeah, right.
It makes sense.
Well, I've argued that there is no political dose unless you're being brainwashed or you already have feelings that you just sort out under a psychedelic experience.
I disagree. I think the dose is political, but where you come down on it.
Well, taking a dose is obviously
the tension is political
act because it's fucking illegal. So there's that. And I will say that there the coaching and the preparation, like, I think it's good, and I would like to live in that world where there is You know, they're like, look, I spent a lot of time in Latin America, and one of the reasons why I started speaking publicly about psychedelics was that I saw the use of psychedelics in communities where it wasn't stigmatized and where it was normalized, and families and family members were taking them together, and that was beautiful. So I'd like to live in that world more broadly. I don't know what the fuck I was going to say other than that.
Well, I'm going to address Hatron's question in chat. Yeah. DMT as a potential therapeutic, ? Got a lot of news coverage after the small pharma trial was approved in the UK, or just exploiting theoretical economic benefits. My answer to that is both.
Yeah.
Potentially therapeutic, I think absolutely. And being exploited because it's in and out, businessman's trip, of course, both.
Yes, and
yeah, to me, I can see. You know, a lot of people say, oh, you know, the therapeutic effects are in you know, the higher end dose, duration and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of value in being able to do something real quick, like it can, you know, derail some kind of thought pattern or something.
So
I know you have thoughts on that, Dave. You read a quote recently about something like that. My experience, I think it can just come in like a freight train, and you might have constructed some narrative, it's nonsense bullshit narrative. I think it can be very helpful, just to give you that kind of jolt, perhaps, shake you up a bit, personally.
Yeah, well, and I think when you talk about that jolt, like I think we're going to see DMT, like NN-DMT. We'll probably see 5-MeO-DMT. We will probably see other short-acting, powerful tryptamines that get promoted for disrupting, let's say, acute suicidal ideation or suicidality, which I have questions about, but I think, you know, hell, you could probably do the same with Salvinorin. But like, you know, the notion that like somebody is in a state and trying to disrupt that state or break it up, particularly in like those acute, heavy, like, I don't know what that looks like, you know, in practice. I don't know that there's anything comparable currently. So there's a whole bunch of speculation there. My concern with small pharma, because I saw there was a, as you said, a flurry of press, and their chief scientific and medical officer, Carol Rutledge, said, speaking of DMT, the psychedelic drug breaks up all of the ruminative thought processes in your brain. Mm-hmm. It literally undoes what has been done by either the stress you've been through or the depressive thoughts you have, and hugely increases the making of new connections. Now, DMT does a shitload of things. I certainly would not limit it to either undoing what has been done by the stress you've been through or the depressive thoughts you've had. Again, like I've moderated on the DMT nexus for a long time. I have seen people who have had, I mean, everything from, so partly because DMT is so widely accessible at this point, and particularly in the explosion of availability around like 2012, 2013, it was suddenly available for pretty cheap, like at conferences or at concerts and festivals and things like that. Conferences too, maybe, depending on if you go to the right conference. I'm flashing back to Psychedemia, which the conference Nishay put on at UPenn in 2012, where there was a guy with pupils like dinner plates standing on a chair in the like foyer area. So maybe DMT at concerts, but thinking about conferences, but thinking about DMT and what it can do, right? Having seen people come from those events saying, holy shit, I bought this, I smoked it, I didn't know what the hell it was. How can reality do this? Like I'm disassociated from reality. I'm depersonalized. I don't know how to make meaning. Like I didn't know that was even remotely possible as far as human experiences. How do I put my life back together? Right. And then watching that play out over, you know, days, weeks, months. And obviously when we're talking about a therapeutic approach, we're talking about people who, to the degree that you can with psychedelics, people who should have informed consent about, here are the things that you can expect. To the degree that you can be prepared or forewarned, basically trust your wetware, to quote Gracie and Zarkov, hands and arms inside the ride and away you go, you will come back. But thinking about that, like having had quite a bit of DMT experience and coming back, like every time I'd considered it, there's always that sort of adrenalized rush because you don't know what you're going to get. And having an experience that just tears apart your ontological understanding of reality and just throws it back in your face. Oh, you thought you figured it out, huh? You thought the last breakthrough, you revealed the secret? Well, here, now we're going to break through the breakthrough. And now you don't know what the fuck is going on. Like, figure this one out. Like thinking about people, particularly people in vulnerable states, like, okay, would that disrupt you from your suicidality? Maybe. Would that disrupt you from your depression? Maybe. But now you're left with these huge, potentially massive, staggering questions that like nobody has answers for. Like you're just there needing to make your own meaning. And for me, that was why I found the DMT Nexus. I was typing in Google, 3 months into daily experiences, like how is it possible to encounter disincarnate beings on DMT? And I found a forum full of weirdos. Sorry, Nishay, did you want to?
Oh wait, no, I forgot what I was going to say. Go ahead.
Somebody wants to know, can you microdose it? you can smoke enough where you'll get the tryptamine, like what I call the tryptamine heavies. You get like a body buzz. Because the first times I tried to smoke DMT, I did the light bulb method, which is terrible. If anyone wants to know,
don't do the aluminum foil method either.
Yeah, don't do that either. Glass vapor genie. It's expensive. It's like $100, but it is the way to go. Check out the DMT Nexus for all your DMT questions.
I remembered what I was going to say when you're done. Just okay. Just one thing that I ran into was like I kept running into these experiences where I would like do something in this DMT space that I didn't realize it, but was like the worst thing you could do in the whole universe. And like I would destroy like an entire planet of beings and like be left with like the horrified looks of the onlookers who saw what happened. And then coming back from that kind of experience is like, it's like, did I just kill a whole planet? Like there's no one you can really talk to like have that conversation and feel okay about it. You just have to kind of grapple with that. And it's just something that can be really intense if you're like already really stressed out and you have an experience like that, and it's like it can be heavy. So it's not like going to be going in a positive direction necessarily.
And aftercare, like because this thing is likely going to be sold as I think Pace pointed out, like the businessman's trip, right? Like it's already known for that. Like it's already but the reality is it's not over. Like I remember a guy who smoked DMT shortly, I told him not to. I said, look, you're going to work. You've got work in less than an hour. He's like, oh, but it only lasts for however long. I'm like, yes, but you're going to be thinking about that while you're having the experience, and then you're going to come down and like, you're still going to be altered. And, and sure enough, like he smokes and has this whole, within 30 seconds, his eyes are open. Oh, am I late for work? But then even beyond that, right, as we're seeing firms already talk up aftercare and questions of AI integration, questions of how can this be outsourced, like when you're trying to figure out, and again, I say this having come to the DMT Nexus, trying to find people who I could talk things through, and ultimately not realizing I was looking for a support community, but finding one, when you need people who you can engage with, when you need people who have had the experience, not some doc who's never had the experience and is like, they're there, like it's all fine, you're back to reality. Like that doesn't do shit when you've had an experience that feels realer than real and goes against everything you thought to be true, And so like, I can imagine the aftercare from those experiences almost dwarf, sort of the opposite or the inverse of the MDMA therapy, where like the amount of time needed to integrate and work through is now like this thing where you're going to need ongoing therapy, which, okay, that might be viable. That might be the kind of thing that makes sense within a particular business model. but also just how effective is it for disrupting, let's say, again, just to project and say it's suicidality. I think there might be better tools. Just because it's a short-acting psychedelic and we're now operating under this narrative that psychedelics are great for mental health, and if we can find shorter ones, that will mean like less cost to insurers to have multiple therapists for however long. We're back to that hammer and nail question, where if we've got hammers, everything starts looking like nails.
I would say that, like, you know, the use of DMT in some kind of therapeutic context, at least with regard to integration, you're gonna need a certificate in like ontology to help people get themselves back together. And I mean, in some ways, that sort of seems like out of the frying pan and into the fire, which, hey, that's like, maybe that's an improvement. And from a harm reduction model, going from persistent suicidal ideation to an existential crisis is an improvement. Okay. Like, let's be real. However, is this the best standard of care for people in that situation? Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
like, DMT,
I think it's real interesting.
Yeah.
I relate to
interesting area.
Normie, your experience of like it can help break like kind of thought patterns or cycles. Like, I've had that experience before. But when DMT gets called like therapeutic, I wonder how much is like intellectual stimulation being called therapeutic. Because I have had wonderful experiences on DMT, but if I'm being honest, I lose a lot of them pretty quickly, almost like a dream. And so like the actual experience itself is like helpful in the moment a lot of times, and in a potentially therapeutic way. But the actual experience for me, I lose it fairly quickly. Like, I can still remember imagery and things, but it's so fast. It's like very fast paced and in your face.
There's also like the other kind of variable of being able to work with like coming back, like a practice of like coming back and like immediately, ideally like speaking out like your experience, because it's like when you write back and your voice is still altered and you're still kind of there, it's sort of like having a dream journal or something, where it's like you can actually cultivate a more like dynamic relationship with your dreams. You can like actually, you can have a brief experience that like fades into like a sand art or something that was what it was, but you can also have this other option of engaging with trying to keep track of what you're experiencing it in those brief split seconds of time.
I used to have a notebook that I would write, as I was sort of in my like intense afterglow. But then when I look back at it later, it was like stupid shit.
Yeah, I've got these sketchbooks that are full of that.
Words, like... and it was the most profound thing ever. Like, writing, we can write.
Like, I also things. This, I mean, like my attempt to like deal with my experiences ultimately is why I went to comparative literature, like continental philosophy, like critical theory graduate school, because
you
I
took
was
it
like
real seriously.
Real seriously. No, I was just like, I couldn't get out of my head. I was like, what happened? Like, what is that? What is real? And I wasn't impressed with the philosophy departments. This like, rational, like linear, like the battling, the culture of philosophy is very like macho, you listen to someone's talk and you're like, these are the holes I see with that argument and that kind of thing. And I wasn't interested in that. But stories and like sci-fi and like, concepts around philosophy that you can like meld together, like to me that provided the most like interesting language to try to like tease out some of the implications of what I'd experienced, and I feel like that side is not like a lot of people thinking, oh, I really like psychedelics, I really want to, go into the therapy and get this, $10,000 certificate. A lot of people like don't realize that there are other things that you can do, even if you're intellectually curious about this stuff. Like, it doesn't have to be this one hyper capitalist marketable therapeutic modality. It can be, exploring the implications for consciousness and our senses of ourselves and our relationships to each other. And that, that's one thing I think at Psymposia we're trying to do, is really kind of hold up these other non-hegemonic discourses and say, like, it's totally okay to come party out with the weirdos. You don't have to go this one direction.
Totally. It sort of seems like young Niché was able to like apprehend the gulf between theory and practice in these in these spaces. But no, it's true what you say. Like with Psymposia, we're not just talking about surveillance capitalism. Like, the things that motivate us is the breadth of the experiences that are available on all drugs, although we were definitely personally inspired by psychedelics. And I'd like to see a better world come from all of this exploration. I don't just want Dave in some of our early conversations was, browbeating me with like, don't just be a navel gazer. Psychedelics need to do something if they're going to be useful, not psychedelics for psychedelics sake. And he's right. Like, we live in a world where there are so many problems that are just waiting for somebody to do something about them. And it's a good thing to put your effort
well,
toward.
And I want to say, like, I do think that like there's a place for navel gazing. Like, I'm not opposed to.
It's your navel.
Yes, perfect. But beyond that, like, and like, look, like, Pace, I think you've done a really good job at pointing out consistently through our various like public engagements, like the fact that we're here because we care about this stuff. Like, we wouldn't be having these conversations if we hadn't had personally significant experiences that like contributed to this. And frankly,
excuse me, some of us are here for the clout.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to take that from you. But like the one of the things that struck me, I think earlier today, was that thinking about how quickly the space has changed, that like Niché and I were both at Entheogenesis Australis in December of 2017. And one of the things that was included in my talk there was a project that some folks at the Nexus were working on putting together at that time, because it was a simpler time and it was before the corporadelic incursion, and certainly before I'd really started thinking hard on surveillance capitalism. And we had been working and discussing a project that was aimed at giving, frequently you'll see like the early psychedelic studies or like some of the early papers as researchers prepare to explore a particular drug for a certain application, according to anecdotal reports, blah, 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 blah. And so we were looking to put together a user interface that would allow people, while altered, to sort of do different things, right? So like you could pull it up on your tablet, you could take different tests, you could record effects, you could, sort of interface with it and generate data. And the plan was to create sort of like crowdsourced, anecdotal, self-reported research information that could effectively serve as a bank for researchers to then use to say, hey, like, we've got these data pools that seem to indicate there may be applications of these compounds for these ends. Thinking about that now, and we'd talked about some of the issues about anonymity and making sure that IP addresses were masked and that there wasn't GPS tracking, things like that. But looking at it now and realizing where we're at, and like just having these flashes of holy shit, like, I'm kind of glad that didn't get off the ground, because Niché.
Well, I was just thinking, we were talking earlier about the kind of the like grievance studies, like scandal, where there were all these like bad, like woke, like fakely.
Tell people what grievance studies are.
No, you do it.
Okay, I'm really quickly, just for clarity. There are some chuds on the right who want to call, gender studies, even Black studies, Native American studies, fat studies, all kinds of queer studies, huge disciplines, and they want to lump them into this like derisive, dismissive term called grievance studies. Niché, please continue.
I was inspired by the idea we started earlier with this, like, people with our knowledge who like wanted to make a buck could like go and do that. But it's like you were saying, Pace, it was you, I think, that said leftists like know the same things, but like don't
the
try to
MBAs, the MBAs know.
Yeah, that
MBAs know the same things.
Right. So I was at the time I was laughing to myself like, oh, we should have like a fake, investor pitch that we actually like try to use our experience. But I was thinking this, do you guys know about Timothy Leary's experiential typewriter? Have we talked about that?
Yeah. We haven't talked about it, but I've read about it. Yeah.
So he had this he was like, oh, it's really like, I think it was DMT specifically that he used it with, probably other things as well. But he was like, it's really hard to write in those states of mind. And so they created this typewriter that was like a piece of technology that like, instead of like letters, you'd have like different qualities of experience that you could touch, to represent something about the experience that was beyond just a letter. So like, I don't know, Dave, are you typing about that or?
No.
He's typing on his existent. What is it?
I'm on my experiential typewriter.
But anyway, I was thinking.
Sorry.
Okay, I was thinking about the experiential typewriter in light of what Dave was just saying, and it's like we should have this app pitch, right, where it's like an app version of Timothy Leary's experiential typewriter that like facilitates the collection of data in altered states, and then use that. But I feel like we could make this like fake pitch and like do fundraising for it.
Oh, we've joked about IPO. I mean, there are companies, there are legitimate or at least like decently serious companies that have already pitched and sold and are closed out. I mean, there's at least one of Perception Neuroscience. I think they're the arketamine company that Atai owns. I mean, they exited real quick, and I'm pretty sure.
What do you mean by exited?
They sold. So they created a startup called Perception Neuroscience. They sold it to the folks at Atai, and they got their investors their money back, and then the folks in they sort of made their money on the venture, and now they're on to other things. I won't say bigger and better things.
What was it?
So it's a company that they got a patent on arketamine, which is a ketamine isomer. So S-ketamine is the one that Johnson & Johnson got to market as Spravato, and then Perception Neuroscience has the other isomer, which is basically just like the molecule, like the mirror molecule. I'm not the best person to do the isomer breakdown.
But does that have to do with the apps, or like does that have to do with the app, or is that something else?
Oh, I was just making the point about, because you were talking about creating a pitch. Sorry, I was talking less about that. Like, you absolutely could. And my point was more that like investors are so hungry and people are sort of snapping up whatever they can get their hands on. And in some cases, like, okay, so in the case of Perception Neuroscience, like it's a bona fide compound that we know like has effects, and we can debate the sort of experiential differences between S-ketamine, arketamine, racemic ketamine, and what's best for what. But in some of these cases, you've got companies that are saying, oh, like looking at Field Trip with FT104, or Mindset with their novel, psilocybin-like compound, where they're saying, oh, we've got this thing that's going to be superior to psilocybin, and we haven't gotten it through any clinical testing yet, but it absolutely will be. And so you're making investor pitches, you're bringing people in based on this promise. So Normie and I have joked about like our ability to like, if we wanted to play that game.
I really like this app idea though, because it has the historical connection to the actual like experiential typewriter that Leary like wrote about in his archives that you can go check out. I think they even have the readouts of the experiential keyboards there, like they like really? Went onto some printer paper, and in the archives you can like see the patterns of like data that were collected.
In the archives?
In the New York Public Library.
I would love to like. Did you
collected so much data? Like it'd be so fun to like have some time to go, because I have a lot of it photographed. I took 50,000 photographs of like if that'd be so cool to fundraise money to go through his archives and like present stuff. Like, oh man. But the app, before I forget,
help you fundraise for it.
Yeah, because the app, you guys, we can like test like what kinds of like menus and stuff are really difficult to work with when you're in an altered state and are like a barrier, and not just have like ways that are like interface that's like designed to be pro like altered and very easy to work with, but also a game aspect to it where you like practice like with scuba diving and going and ritualizing the cave like ropes and the arrows. You can like practice with the interface in a game mode to dial it in before you're in the altered state collecting with it.
I think we need like a VR like Wii kind of thing going on, you know, so it's kinetic.
The thing I find terrifying about that, right, is you make your app, we do the thing, right, we optimize it for tripped out experiences, whatever. And then somebody comes in and buys it, right? Somebody makes an offer we can't refuse.
That format gets picked up on TikTok, and
well, I wasn't. that would be fun. Then we can just be used by like Chinese surveillance. That's no issues there.
But that's why I preface this whole thing with like, oh, this can be our fake pitch, because like doing the thing would create this like ethical
right. Well, that's
problem.
Just it. If you follow through, what you wind up with is the companies that are creating the psychedelic mental health apps now just they say we're not interested in that. We're interested in the gamification aspect, and we're interested in the easy to use tripping menus. So we'll strip that out and stick it into our Hoover app and just kind of.
What if I saw this like gel agar like bacteria thing that they did where they put like bacteria sources of food like relative to
slime molds. Slime molds have been able to model transportation networks.
They're like efficient like ways to organize the highways and stuff between them. Like what if like we could figure certain things out about interfaces like through this app that translate to like making better interfaces like outside of our linear way of thinking.
Shay's gone. You're gonna get
well, we're gonna get lost her to the corporadelics.
Yeah, she's gone.
Someone's gonna give her a grant to do that archive, offer you something you can't refuse, and then pretty soon you're gonna like
see you later.
Fucking creating a semiotic panopticon for us all to live in,
Don't forget us when you're famous.
Or not.
We have a Patreon
and YouTube
subscribers. That's great. And merch, check out the Corporadelic shirt.
Right, Corporadelic shirt right here.
People have bought that recently, like $5. a few people.
Someone in our chat has bought that actually.
Oh no way. Dude, and someone bought our bathing suit right the other day. We sold a bathing suit. Bathing suit.
I am a great bathing suit designer.
You designed it. You've designed a bathing suit that people have now like bought, presumably to wear.
That was one of my skills.
Put that in your Twitter bio.
But we are a non-profit, which means that we're listener supported
and poor.
And I mean, let's this is a live stream. Let's talk real stuff. There's this nexus. I think I saw it somewhere. I think it was in the Innuendo Studios about like somewhere in the series of the like alt-right playbook videos about how like the Democratic Party like has certain difficulties because they want to build a coalition, but they also need to appease like rich donors. So we're in this like perfect nexus where we're certainly not appeasing most rich donors, and we're also like not whipping up like an angry racist base or something. So if you want to go on over to Patreon and support us monthly, that's wonderful. Anyhow.
No, but seriously, it goes a long way. I mean, at this point, like, pretty much everything that we've been able to do, I mean, between paying our sound guy for the podcasts and being able to host the various, I mean, it's all like having that month-to-month support has been kind of huge. Largely because, I mean, we don't pay ourselves at this point. This is all truly like labor of love stuff, and like it comes back to that conversation we've had about like actually caring and wanting to put some of these critiques out there we know that it act like I've watched, let's say, over my own sort of public engagement, as I went from sort of like on the fence where people would be willing to engage or like bring my ideas into their conference spaces, recognizing that there was some risk because, there were critiques of maps or other people, and then watching, say over like 2018, 2019, as some of the conferences were bringing in corporate sponsors and recognizing that like having me there, like I watched myself start to get shuttered out of spaces. And so finding a group of people who were actually willing and excited about, sort of not towing that line and just being explicit with the critiques and being able to put it out there. I mean, having people who support us and appreciate that and are willing to come along for the ride really lets us continue to do this to whatever degree we're able to. So thanks.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're 2.5 hours in.
Like, there was one thing I meant to say earlier that
I'm not trying to close. I'm like, what do we
just
not?
Before during with that conversation about micro versus macro dosing and just like therapeutic use and blah blah blah, I just wanted to note that one of my most therapeutic experiences with LSD doesn't fit into a lot of these like boxes of the way we think about what a therapeutic experience is and like the environments to be conducive to that. And it's specifically that like I have lived my entire life in like severe chronic pain. And so much of that was like, being like autistic and really anxious and growing up with an autistic mother who didn't teach me, how to like be in the world in a normal way. And so I was storing all of this like anxiety in the way I was holding my body. And I had no idea. There's no way you could have like talked to me and like gotten me to recognize that I was doing that. But then on this psychedelic experience that I think, was a higher dose, and I think that was conducive versus a micro dose, I was sitting and all of a sudden this just like unbearable, like drive to stretch came upon me that like I never felt in normal life. So my body was like really alien to me, and like stretching wasn't something I ever did or felt comfortable doing. And suddenly it was like, I need to stretch. And I did this like slow unwind of like my entire spine that took a process of a few hours. I was like lying there and just stretching. And at the end of it, I was covered in sweat. Like I'd been working so hard, even though I was lying down and stretching, stretching out my tight spine and back. And for weeks afterwards, for the first time in my adult life that I had any memory of, including into childhood, actually, I didn't have any pain for a few weeks. Like, and I was just like that. And there's no way like a therapist could have taught me how to do that. I wasn't expecting it to happen. I didn't even know it was possible, speaking about these DMT things. And so we need to be able to acknowledge that those kinds of experiences happen and like are part of the conversation. And a therapeutic dose isn't just forgiving the people who have like abused you in your life and coming back and like being able to cry with your therapist about it. That's like one approach to it, but it's so much more than that. And so I just wanted to mention that.
No, thank you. And what you're describing is part of the rhetoric. Like MAPS has long talked about the inner healer. Okay. And like, thanks MAPS for telling anyone who's taken a psychedelic that's been beneficial, for acknowledging that. But the idea that we need like a midwife for these experiences, like, I don't know that we do. In some ways, I think, what we need more is like a, if we need anything is somebody to like prevent you from, doing things that are harmful to yourself or others. That's about it, And I mean, I've had many therapeutic experiences on psychedelics. I attribute a high dose mushroom experience to like healing me from a prolonged paranoid episode in my early 20s. It's a story I literally told at a Psymposia event. Brian, you weren't there.
I wasn't there.
This is in Portland. But I'm open. I've been open over the years with my students with the fact that the one of the reasons I pursued science is that like I kind of just sort of slipped, like a slippery slope into like conspiracy stuff. And some of it, like I'll date myself right here. Like I worked at a PR firm for my first like grown-up job. And I got laid off 2 weeks after 9/11. And yeah, anyhow, I fell into deep conspiracy for a little while, and I was very interested in extraterrestrials, among other things. But it was a high dose experience with mushrooms that did feel like I was communicating with something else, something big. It was, as Dave said earlier, it was an immersive experience, a very colorful experience. And there was something very old that was like talking directly to me. And I had, they talk about set and setting. My intention for that experience was to go into the woods and find aliens, as I had done.
And you found them
several
yeah.
and yes, I did in fact find them. But I came out of the experience completely no longer interested in those topics at all. Like I was literally able to just like get on my life and not be such a fucking nuisance to like literally everybody I spoke to. But I mean, I gotta say, like, after that, I was like, well, how do people sort fact from fiction? And the scientific method is one good way to figure out that which we don't agree on and we have to agree on. And so I became trained in that. And I've been very open with my students over the years that's my story. I usually, some of the students I've mentored, I've mentioned the mushrooms. But yeah, psychedelics are useful. You don't know what you're going to get though.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think too, like the sort of range of what gets considered therapeutic is in that case, right, sort of walking into the woods and getting the immersion and coming out with that realization, or in the case of like Nishé's stretching, like, I mean, I can think, my own, some of my more recent experiences in more recent years, like finding myself suddenly like doing a headstand or wall sit, like, from the floor with legs up the wall. And then, a couple hours later, realizing I've been holding that position as whatever else happens around me. And again, that sense, whether you want to call it the inner healer or some sort of instinctive, impulsive drive towards what, like however you frame it, like finding those spaces where something clicks, right? Like, and I think, Pace, you've talked before in one of our, I think, earlier episodes about like finding space to fall apart, right?
Yeah.
And then
one
of the things that I think has been a question from me along these lines of like therapy versus recreation versus, and go figure, right, with psychedelics that you'll find that those boundaries dissolve and it's all kind of a mishmash. But and I guess it ties to set and setting too, like thinking about those days where how many of the reflections that you have, how many of the experiences you have over the course of that session or whatever, how much of that is a result of taking the psychedelic and how much of that is a result of having set aside like a day for that experience where
I'm with you on this,
like
absolutely. And when we were talking about music earlier and how that like the standardization of music, like every mushroom trip I've ever had has been centered around like music for the most part. And it's been like a playlist that I took the time to like sit down and like put together, and a lot of times put together with friends I knew I was doing it with. And like that kind of intention like makes the experience just as much like, well, yeah, like you said, blends the line between therapeutic and recreational, because it's totally recreational. We did it for recreation, but the therapeutic benefits kind of came in turn.
But were you doing it for recreation?
Unknowing. Sure.
I had this several year. Go ahead, Nishay.
I was just say it kind of reminds me of like recreation in the sense of like hiking at some really gorgeous spot. You know, it's not recreation
Exactly,
like just like trying to like, you know, waste your time or whatever. Like not that recreate, yeah, you know what I mean. But just having that intentional planning of like picking this really nice spot and like packing lunches and like, you know, looking forward to this trip that you'd planned and like put all this stuff, you know, it's that kind of, I think there's a parallel there anyway.
The point is the experience, right?
Yeah.
You can go see a beautiful thing just to see a beautiful thing. That's
right.
gold.
I had
Wait,
this
how much
3-year
does it cost, Dave? Sorry,
I had this
Brian, please go on.
Yeah, I've tried 4 times. I had this tradition on New Year's that I would at it was like, you know, at 11:59 I would light up my DMT pipe at 11:59, and that really blurred kind of the lines of recreational and therapeutic, and at least 2 of those times was definitely both of those things. I do recommend it if you want to kind of play around with some of those things. One time I had a Ravi Shankar playlist on, which was amazing. Which was amazing when you listen to like a 20-minute song that gets how he builds it up, and it tells a story through the writing of the song, and tension builds to this point that it's like unbelievable, and then breaks down and gets really peaceful. And the other thing on New Year's, just because it's kind of appropriate because we're right there, one of the DMT New Year's experiences was I all time got compressed until that moment and just spit out the other side. Everything, the whole year compressed into this fine point and then exploded. And then it was actually kind of cool because everybody that was outside, the horns were blowing, and everybody was like, there was like a celebration going on outside my house at the same time that I was popping through the other side of the year. And I realized, like, a lot of people who say New Year's resolutions or whatever, what actually that means, it's like this blank slate. Even though it's just this kind of made up idea, you have this blank slate to play on to write your year again. And a lot of stuff just shed off. And I kind of like experienced that. It was interesting for sure.
Normie, all ideas are made up.
I'm interested in holiday specific types of like curating altered states, because that's a good one. I was also thinking as like, you know, so you said something like Valentine's Day, if like every year, you know, you check in with your partner or something, you know, where you just have this like, you know, MDMA session of like, but like really like connecting and like stuff like that. I feel like setting aside a holiday that's like recurring, you know, is like an interesting way to pair that. And so the New Year's DMT could
I
be
did
like
it 3
another...
years. I did it 3 years in a row. The first year was the Ravi Shankar, that one was really tied to family and the importance of family. The second one was, I think, popping through the other side. And the third one, speaking to the complete randomness of DMT, was I had ancestor shadow people at the foot of my bed, and I was in the land of the dead, and I need to get the fuck out of here immediately because I'm not supposed to see this. Go away. Like, and that was not a good experience whatsoever. I mean, it was that's a bad word. I'm glad I had it. I'm glad I had it. It wasn't pleasant by any. There was 0% pleasure or good feelings in that experience whatsoever. So like the kind of the randomness, yeah. I was hoping to have one of the pop through the other, you know, side experiences. I didn't get that whatsoever though.
I mean, what Nishay's getting at, I think, is some sense of ritual.
Mm-hmm. And like integration, but like into like the culture, like what that could look like, you know, having some kind of like ritualistic recurring use of it.
An advent calendar with mystery doses.
Well, no, fuck, that's a hell of a month.
Yeah.
And now you're gonna want some microdoses in there. So
well, that's what I was gonna say. They don't all have to be active. You just have to make sure every evening is clear, because who knows? I
mean, I think we should talk more about this at some point. But I think what Nishay was talking about, or at least about reoccurring use. It's something that is really not spoken about much in the medical paradigm. Is that most people who are like experienced with psychedelics don't just take them to solve a problem in their life. It is a conversation that recurs, and I see a healthier version of life and relationships that like integrate psychedelics in some semi-regular, intentional framework. As Dave has said, psychedelics to do something. I think that's healthy, but I don't think just like, the celebration of holidays in general, which are what about you and your family and your friends, right? The commercialization of all of that is unwelcome. I'm sorry, what was that?
I said holidays are about getting shit, right?
Yeah, sure.
And can I say just like a real quick point about the music thing as well? Because I was just thinking, as Russ was saying, and like the connection to the music and the experience, just how much like I presented at conferences like about the fact that the sciences are a way of communicating abstractions, like concepts and averages, whereas like the arts are all about learning to communicate experience, like subjective, specific experience, and that's something that there's so much value in studying the arts broadly conceived, including language and humanities in general for psychedelics. And that's not part of this conversation, the medical therapeutic, like scaled golem conversation.
But it will be if you keep talking.
You got to get on that pitch, you guys. But I think for tonight, we're probably going to wrap unless anyone has any
final thoughts.
Yeah.
Burning thoughts and questions. It's really incredible that those of you who have been on this live stream have been on for like this entire time, more or less. So thank you. We really appreciate it. We will see you next time. We've got episodes that are in the can and coming out. And yeah, we're going to keep doing these live streams because they're fun. They're fun.
Oh, and also we're really close now to 5,000 subscribers on YouTube. So we were going to, once we hit this 5,000 mark, do like a 5,000 subscriber Q&A just to like celebrate that little milestone. So when that happens, we'll message on the newsletter at Psymposia.com. People can sign up if you're not signed up. And people can like any questions, including like favorite weird sushi shit. Or what was that?
I said including weird shit. Send us your weird shit and we will do our best to answer.
Which psychedelic advent calendar day do you most hope to open tomorrow? But yeah, so keep in touch, and we'll be also putting out the podcast soon. And in the future, we're thinking of maybe trying to experiment with like some of the content that we make, like new video kind of modes. We might do portions of live like recordings, so like people can like hang in and like, we'll go over the material live and with feedback and stuff. And then if anyone like wants to hang out with us while we're doing it.
Yeah, we're going to be playing around with video formats a lot this next year. Do YouTube a lot more. We've been discussing it a while, thanks to Nishay.
Did you say next year? Because I think this is our last live stream of this year. So any of you all listening, be safe this new year. Make sure you see the next one, okay?
Break those DMT pipes at it.
11:59:57.
We call that the normie special. So or at least we will from now on. All right. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.